I spent 40 years saving lives at sea. I pulled drowning children from riptides, rescued sailors from sinking ships, and never once hesitated. But at 2 in the morning, when my daughter, a homicide detective, called and whispered, "Don't trust Dad," I didn't understand. I am Dad. Then I heard my son's footsteps on the lighthouse stairs, and I realized something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Sometimes, the person you need saving from is your own blood. The phone had vibrated against the nightstand at exactly 2:07 in the morning. I know the time because I'd been watching the clock for hours, unable to sleep as the hurricane howled outside my window. The Morrison Lighthouse had weathered 150 years of storms, but this one felt different, angrier, like the sea itself was trying to tell me something. Emma's name glowed on the screen. My daughter never called this late. Never. In 15 years as a homicide detective with the Boston Police Department, she'd learned to compartmentalize her work and her family. She didn't bring murder cases home, and she didn't wake her 68-year-old father in the middle of the night, unless something was terribly wrong. I answered on the second ring, my voice rough with exhaustion. "Emma, what's happened?" "Dad." Her voice was barely a whisper, tight with something I'd never heard from her before. Fear. Raw, undisguised fear. Listen to me very carefully. Don't react. Don't make any noise. The wind screamed against the lighthouse walls. Somewhere below, I heard a door slam shut. "Lock your bedroom door," Emma continued, her words rushing together. "Do it now." Quietly. I was already moving, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The lock clicked into place, the sound swallowed by the storm. "Good," Emma breathed. "Now listen to me, Dad. I need you to stay in that room until I get there. I'm coming. I'm already in the air. Coast Guard helicopter. But Dad, this is the most important thing I've ever told you." Another door slammed below. Closer this time. "Don't trust Dad." The words didn't make sense. They rattled around in my skull like loose change, refusing to settle into any pattern I could understand. "Emma, I am Dad. What are you?" "No." Her voice cracked. "Jack. Don't trust Jack. He's been calling himself Dad to Lily on the phone, and I've been using the code in case anyone was listening. Dad, Jack is coming for you. He's going to try to take you outside. He's going to say there's damage to the lighthouse, that you need to check it together. Whatever you do, don't go with him. Jack, my son, my 42-year-old boy who used to sit on my shoulders and watch the lighthouse beam sweep across the water, who used to ask me why we saved strangers from the sea. Emma, that's insane. Jack wouldn't. Dad, I don't have time to explain everything. I've been investigating him for 2 months. He owes $1.2 million to very dangerous people, and he's been slowly poisoning you for months to make everyone think you have dementia. The supplements Melissa has been giving you, they're not vitamins. They're making you see things, making you confused. It's all been planned. Every single moment. The footsteps were on the stairs now. The spiral staircase that led up from the main house to the lighthouse tower. Each step groaned under someone's weight, a sound I'd heard 10,000 times before. But tonight, it sounded like a death march. "He's here," I whispered. "I know. Dad, I need you to survive for 45 minutes. That's all. Can you do that for me? 45 minutes. 2,700 seconds between me and safety. Between me and the truth about what my own son had become. I can do that," I said. "I've survived. Worse. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart." The line went dead, and then I heard it. Knuckles rapping against my bedroom door. Gentle, almost tender. "Dad?" Jack's voice, warm and concerned. "Dad, are you awake? I heard you moving around. Listen, I think the storm might have damaged something on the east side. We should check it out together." The east side. where the cliffs dropped 60 feet into the churning Atlantic, where my wife Ruth had fallen 3 years ago, where no one would hear me scream. I pressed my back against the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. Through the window, the lighthouse beams swept across the room, illuminating everything for one brief second before plunging it back into darkness. In that flash of light, I saw the shadow of my son's feet beneath the door. He wasn't moving. He was waiting. "Dad?" His voice was different now, sharper. "Open the door. We need to talk." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because in that moment, I finally understood what my daughter had been trying to tell me. The man on the other side of that door wasn't my son anymore. He was something else, entirely. Something that had been growing in the dark for years, feeding on resentment and greed, and the terrible weight of expectations he could never meet. And tonight, in the middle of the worst storm in a decade, he had come to finish what he'd started. Let me tell you how I ended up hiding from my own son in the lighthouse my family has kept for 4 generations. My name is Harold Morrison. Most people call me Harry. I'm 68 years old, and I've spent the last 40 years of my life doing one thing: pulling people out of the ocean when the ocean decided it wanted to keep them. I was 17 when I joined the Rockport Coast Guard Station as a volunteer. By 22, I was a full-time rescue swimmer. By 30, I was captain of my own search and rescue vessel. I've jumped into 40-degree water in the middle of January. I've rappelled from helicopters onto the decks of sinking fishing boats. I've held dying men in my arms and promised them they'd see their families again. Then spent the next 6 hours fighting to make sure that promise wasn't a lie. In 4 decades, I saved 347 lives. I know the exact number because I kept a journal. Ruth made me start it after my first rescue, a 12-year-old boy who'd fallen off his father's lobster boat. She said I should remember them all. Every single person who got a second chance because I was willing to risk my life for theirs. Ruth was right about most things. She was especially right about that. The Morrison Lighthouse has stood on this cliff since 1874. My great-great-grandfather, Elijah Morrison, built it with his own hands after watching 3 ships wreck against the rocks in a single winter. He said the sea had taken enough from Rockport. It was time someone pushed back. 4 generations of Morrisons have kept that light burning. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and now me. The lighthouse itself is 112 feet tall. White painted brick that's been repainted so many times, there's probably more paint than brick at this point. The beacon at the top still uses the original Fresnel lens, a massive thing made of hand-ground glass that catches the light and throws it 23 miles out to sea. On a clear night, sailors say they can see it all the way from Portland. Attached to the lighthouse is the keeper's house, a 3-story Victorian that my grandfather built in 1922. 5 bedrooms, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Ruth refused to replace even after I bought her a modern one, a living room with windows that face the Atlantic, where you can watch the storms roll in from 100 miles away. The whole property sits on 11 acres of coastal land, rocky cliffs on 3 sides, a winding gravel road on the 4th. The real estate developers have been circling for years, sending letters, making phone calls, showing up unannounced with glossy brochures about maximizing the potential of the property. $4.2 million. That's what the last one offered. $4.2 million for the land, the lighthouse, and 150 years of Morrison history. I threw his brochure in the fireplace and told him the lighthouse wasn't for sale. Ruth laughed when I told her about it later. "Harry Morrison," she said, shaking her head. "You're the most stubborn man on the entire eastern seaboard." "Second most stubborn," I corrected her. "You married me, didn't you?" She threw a dish towel at my head, and I caught it, and we laughed until our sides hurt. That was 3 years and 4 months ago, 2 weeks before the storm that took her from me. I thought I understood sacrifice. I thought 40 years of rescue work had taught me everything there was to know about loss and survival and the terrible mathematics of who lives and who dies. I was wrong. The sea doesn't just take strangers. Sometimes it takes the people you love most. And sometimes, the danger doesn't come from the water at all. It comes from inside your own house. From the son you raised and the trust you gave freely, and the blind spots that every father has when he looks at his children. I spent my whole life saving other people. It never occurred to me that one day I'd be the one who needed saving, that the rescue swimmer would become the drowning man. But that's exactly what happened. And if you'll bear with an old lighthouse keeper for a little while longer, I'll tell you how my own blood tried to throw me to the rocks, and how my daughter flew through a hurricane to pull me back from the edge. It starts, as most things do, with a death. Not mine, my wife's. 3 years ago, the sea took everything from me. It was October, the kind of gray autumn day when the clouds hang so low you can almost touch them. The Weather Service had issued a storm warning, but it wasn't supposed to hit until evening. Ruth and I had the whole afternoon to ourselves. We were walking along the cliff path on the east side of the property, the route we'd taken together almost every day for 37 years of marriage. Ruth liked to collect sea glass there. She had jars of it all over the house, bits of broken bottles that the ocean had tumbled smooth. She said they were proof that even broken things could become beautiful again if you gave them enough time. I was 50 feet ahead of her when I heard the scream, not Ruth's scream. I spun around and saw them both at the same time. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing at the edge of the cliff where the path had eroded away. She must have wandered over from the public beach a half-mile south. And Ruth, my Ruth, already moving toward her, with that look on her face I'd seen 1,000 times before. The look that said someone needed help, and she wasn't going to wait for permission to give it. "Ruth! Wait!" I shouted, but the wind stole my words and scattered them across the rocks. The ground beneath the girl's feet crumbled. She dropped, her small hands clawing at the air, and Ruth lunged forward without a second's hesitation. She caught the girl's wrist, held on, braced her feet against the rocky soil, and pulled. I was running. 40 years of rescue training screaming through my muscles, pushing me faster than I'd moved in decades. 50 feet had never felt so far. Ruth got the girl up over the edge. I saw the child scramble to safety on solid ground, crying but alive. And then I saw Ruth's foot slip on the loose gravel. She didn't scream. That's what I remember most. Ruth Morrison, who had yelled at me for leaving wet towels on the bathroom floor, who had cheered so loud at Emma's high school graduation that people 3 rows up turned around to stare, didn't make a single sound as she fell. I reached the edge in time to see her hit the rocks 60 feet below. The rest of that day exists in fragments, calling the Coast Guard, watching my former colleagues retrieve my wife's body from the churning water, holding Emma while she sobbed into my shoulder, telling Jack over the phone because he was in Portland and couldn't get back until the next morning. The little girl survived. Her name was Sophie Chen. Her father found me at the memorial service a week later, tears streaming down his face, trying to thank me for what Ruth had done. I couldn't speak. I just shook his hand and walked away, because looking at him meant accepting that my wife had traded her life for his daughter's. It was a trade Ruth would have made without hesitation. I knew that. She'd been married to a rescue swimmer for 37 years. She understood the math. One life for another. The algebra of sacrifice. But knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. After the funeral, I stopped leaving the lighthouse. The rescue work I'd retired from 5 years earlier suddenly felt impossible. How could I save strangers when I couldn't save my own wife? How could I pull people from the water when the woman I loved was lying in Rockport Cemetery with an ocean view she'd never see? The guilt was the worst part. I was the rescue swimmer. I was the one who'd spent 40 years cheating death. And when it mattered most, when the person drowning was the one I loved more than anything in the world, I was 50 feet too far away. I kept the lighthouse running because Ruth would have wanted me to. Every night at sunset, I climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the tower and made sure the beacon was lit. I watched the beam sweep across the water, warning ships away from the rocks that had claimed so many lives. And sometimes, late at night when the wind was howling and the waves were crashing against the cliffs, I swore I could still see her out there, standing at the edge where she'd fallen, her silver hair whipping in the storm, watching me with those sad, knowing eyes. I told myself it was grief. Just my mind playing tricks on me. I had no idea how wrong I was. Ruth and I raised 2 children in the shadow of that lighthouse. One became my salvation. The other became my destruction. Emma came first, born in the summer of 1986 during a thunderstorm so fierce the power went out halfway through Ruth's labor. I delivered her myself on the kitchen floor, guided by flashlight and 40 years of emergency training. She came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, and she's never stopped fighting since. From the moment she could walk, Emma was drawn to the water. She'd toddle down to the tide pools, while Ruth and I watched from the porch, filling her little bucket with hermit crabs and sea snails. By 8, she was swimming in the cove. By 12, she was crewing on my rescue boat during training exercises. By 16, she told me she wanted to be a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, just like her old man. That dream changed somewhere along the way. Emma went to Boston University on a criminal justice scholarship and fell in love with detective work. She said it was the same thing, really, finding people who were lost, bringing them home, just without the hypothermia. She's 38 now, a homicide detective with the Boston Police Department, sharp as a filleting knife and twice as dangerous. She calls every Sunday without fail, drives up for holidays, sends pictures of my granddaughter Lily, blowing out birthday candles and losing teeth. Emma never forgot where she came from. The lighthouse is in her blood, same as it's in mine. Jack was different from the start. He arrived 4 years after Emma, in 1990, a quiet baby who rarely cried and slept through the night from his second week. Ruth said he was an easy child. Looking back, I think he was just watching, waiting, taking notes on a family he never quite felt part of. Jack hated the lighthouse, hated the isolation, the endless gray winters, the way the foghorn would shake the walls at 3 in the morning. While Emma was swimming in the cove, Jack was in his room reading books about cities, about skyscrapers and subway systems, and places where the ocean was just a blue line on the horizon. "I don't want to save people from the water," he told me once, when he was maybe 14. "Stuck in the same place your whole life, waiting for someone else to drown." The words hit harder than he probably intended. Or maybe he meant every syllable. With Jack, I was never quite sure. He left for college at 18 and never really came back. University of Maine, then an MBA in Portland, then a job with some real estate investment firm that I never fully understood. He'd visit for Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving, always with an excuse ready for why he couldn't stay longer. Work was busy. The drive was terrible. He'd make it up next time. Next time never seemed to come. Ruth made excuses for him. "He's building his career, Harry. He's finding himself. He'll come around." And I wanted to believe her. The same way I wanted to believe that the distance between my son and me was just geography, not something deeper and colder that had been growing since he was old enough to resent me. When Ruth died, Jack flew in for the funeral and left the next morning. "Business emergency," he said. Couldn't be helped. He stood at the grave for maybe 15 minutes, didn't cry, hugged me once with the stiff formality of a stranger, and drove away without looking back. Emma stayed for 2 weeks. She helped me sort through Ruth's clothes, cancel her magazine subscriptions, figure out which bills were on autopay and which ones weren't. She held me when I broke down, sobbing in the middle of the kitchen because I'd found Ruth's reading glasses tucked behind the coffee maker, waiting for her to come back. That's the difference between my children, distilled into its purest form. Emma stays. Jack leaves. I told myself it was just who he was. Some children grow up and grow away, and you have to love them from a distance whether you like it or not. I made peace with it, or at least I thought I did, but I never imagined he'd come back to take everything from me. The lighthouse, the land, the 4 generations of Morrison history that he'd spent his whole life trying to escape. I never imagined my own son would try to erase me completely, just so he could finally be free of this place. But that's exactly what he did. And it started 8 months ago, with a phone call and a gift. I should have known better than to accept. 8 months ago, Jack called with what he said was a gift. I should have known better than to trust a gift from a son who never gave without expecting something in return. It was a Sunday afternoon in March. I was in the Lighthouse Tower, polishing the Fresnel lens the way Ruth used to do every week. The glass was over 100 years old, hand-ground by craftsmen who understood that a lighthouse keeper's job wasn't just about keeping the light burning. It was about making sure that light was worth something, that it could cut through the darkest storm and find the ships that needed finding. My phone rang. Jack's name on the screen. He hadn't called in almost 2 months. Dad. His voice was warm, warmer than I'd heard it in years. How are you holding up? The question caught me off guard. Jack didn't ask how I was holding up. Jack asked if I'd thought about selling the property. Jack asked if I'd updated my will. Jack talked about market values and development potential and the importance of being realistic about the future. I'm fine, I said cautiously. Just doing some maintenance on the lens. That old thing. He laughed, and it almost sounded genuine. Listen, Dad, I've been thinking. That lighthouse has been in our family for 150 years. It's a piece of history. It deserves to be preserved properly. I waited. With Jack, there was always a second shoe waiting to drop. I've been talking to some people in the preservation community, he continued. There's a woman, a specialist in historic lighthouse restoration. Her name's Melissa Crane. She's done incredible work up and down the coast. The Portland Headlight, the Marshall Point Lighthouse, places you've probably heard of. I had heard of them. They were famous, well-maintained, tourist attractions that charged $15 a head and sold gift shop trinkets made in China. What exactly are you proposing, Jack? Just an assessment. No commitment, no contracts. Melissa comes out, takes a look at the property, gives us a professional opinion on what it would take to preserve the lighthouse for future generations. That's all. Future generations. The phrase hung in the air between us. Jack didn't have children. He'd never shown any interest in having them. Emma had Lily. But Emma had also made it clear that she wanted her daughter to choose her own path, not inherit obligations from a previous century. I don't know, Jack. I've had plenty of developers sniffing around. I'm not interested in. This isn't about development, Dad. His voice softened. This is about family, about legacy. I know I haven't been around much since Mom died. I know I've been distant, but I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. And I realize that I've been running from this place my whole life instead of appreciating what it means. Something cracked in my chest. Something I'd been holding together with wire and hope for years. You mean that? I asked, and I hated how desperate I sounded. How hungry for any scrap of connection with my own son. I mean it, Dad. Let me do this one thing. Let me help preserve what you and Mom built here. What our family has protected for 4 generations. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded references, checked credentials, called Emma, and asked for her professional opinion. But I was lonely. I was grieving. And my son, my distant, difficult son, was finally reaching out. Okay, I said. Send her out. Great. She can be there next weekend. And Dad, thank you. This means a lot to me. Lookly mend. In the munder. Lookly mend dollar Brents. He hung up before I could respond. I stood there in the lighthouse tower, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and told myself that maybe I'd been wrong about Jack. Maybe Ruth had been right all along. Maybe he just needed time to find his way back. Melissa Crane arrived the following Saturday in a silver SUV with Massachusetts plates. She was 35. Maybe younger. with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. Mr. Morrison. She shook my hand firmly, her eyes already scanning the lighthouse behind me. Jack has told me so much about this place. It's even more beautiful than I imagined. Call me Harry, I said. Mr. Morrison was my father. She laughed. A light, musical sound that reminded me of wind chimes. Harry it is. And please, call me Melissa. I have a feeling we're going to be spending a lot of time together. She was charming, professional, knowledgeable. She knew the history of the lighthouse better than I expected, asking questions about the original construction, the various renovations over the years, the story behind the Fresnel lens. And when Jack arrived that evening to check on things, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Satisfaction. At the time, I thought it was pride. Pride in the family legacy he was finally embracing. Now I know it was something else entirely. The look of a predator watching his trap snap shut. Melissa moved into the guest cottage within a week. She said it would make the assessment easier, more thorough. She needed to observe the lighthouse at different times of day, understand how the light interacted with the weather patterns, document the structural integrity during various conditions. It all sounded so reasonable, so professional. What she really meant was that it would make poisoning me easier. The guest cottage sat about 200 feet from the main house, a small two-bedroom structure my grandfather had built for visiting relatives. Ruth and I had renovated it 15 years ago, adding modern plumbing and a small kitchen. After Ruth died, I'd let it sit empty. The idea of someone else living there, someone who wasn't family, had felt like a betrayal. But Melissa made it feel natural. She was considerate, respectful of boundaries. She'd knock before coming to the main house. She'd text ahead if she wanted to discuss her findings. She treated the lighthouse with a kind of reverence that reminded me of Ruth. That should have been my first warning. No one loves something that much unless they want something from it. The meals started during her second week. She'd show up at the main house around dinner time with containers of homemade food. Beef stew, chicken, casserole, a fish chowder that she said was her grandmother's recipe from Nova Scotia. "You're too thin, Harry," she'd say, setting the containers on the counter. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" I couldn't remember. Since Ruth died, I'd been surviving on canned soup and frozen dinners, eating just enough to keep functioning. The lighthouse needed tending. Everything else felt optional. Melissa changed that. She made cooking feel like an act of care rather than a chore. She'd sit with me while I ate, asking questions about the lighthouse's history, about Ruth, about the rescues I'd performed over the years. She listened like someone who genuinely wanted to know, not like someone waiting for their turn to talk. It felt good to be heard. It felt good to matter to someone again. The supplements came during her fourth week. "I noticed you've been tired lately," Melissa said one evening, pulling a small brown bottle from her bag. "Completely natural, given everything you've been through, but I brought you something that might help." She set the bottle on the kitchen table. The label read, "Coastal Wellness Herbal Complex." Below that, a list of ingredients I didn't recognize. Valerian root, kava extract, something called phenibut that I'd never heard of. "It's all natural," she assured me. "Herbs and plant extracts. My mother swears by this brand, says it helped her through menopause. It's especially good for stress and sleep quality." I picked up the bottle, turning it over in my hands. "I don't know, Melissa. I've never been much for supplements. Just try it for a week." She smiled. That warm, reassuring smile that made you feel like she had your best interests at heart. What's the worst that could happen? I took 2 capsules that night before bed. Woke up the next morning, feeling groggy, disconnected, like my thoughts were swimming through molasses. I chalked it up to sleeping too deeply for the first time in months. By the end of the second week, the fog had become permanent. I'd walk into rooms and forget why I'd come. I'd start sentences and lose the words halfway through. I'd look at paintings Ruth had hung on the walls, Paintings I'd seen every day for 30 years, and struggled to remember when we'd bought them. Worst of all, I started forgetting her. It happened for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel, and I couldn't remember her name, my wife. The woman I'd loved for 37 years, the mother of my children, and her name had simply vanished from my mind, like a wave retreating from the shore. The panic hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of my chair, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This couldn't be happening. Not this. Anything but this. Ruth, I whispered, and the name came back to me like a gift, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Ruth, Ruth, Ruth. I said it over and over, terrified that if I stopped, I'd lose her again. That night, I told Melissa what had happened. She held my hand and looked at me with such gentle concern that I nearly wept. Harry, she said softly, that's completely normal for someone your age, especially with everything you've been through. The grief, the isolation, the stress. It takes a toll on the mind. She squeezed my hand. But don't worry. I'm here now. I'll take care of you. I believed her. God help me. I believed every word. I know what you're thinking. A 68-year-old man seeing his dead wife's ghost? Classic signs of dementia. Early onset Alzheimer's. The slow, inevitable decay of a mind that's outlived its usefulness. That's exactly what they wanted everyone to believe. The first time I saw Ruth after she died, really saw her, not just a flicker in my peripheral vision, was 3 weeks after I started taking Melissa's supplements. It was past midnight. The lighthouse beam swept across the property in its endless rotation, casting long shadows that danced and shifted with each pass. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, something that happens more often at my age, and I happened to glance out the bedroom window. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, the east cliff, the exact spot where she'd fallen 3 years ago. Ruth was wearing the blue cardigan I'd given her for our 30th anniversary. Her silver hair was loose, blowing in a wind I couldn't feel from inside the house, and she was looking directly at me. Not through me. At me. I stopped breathing. My hand found the window frame, gripping it so hard the wood creaked under my fingers. Ruth? I whispered. She didn't answer, didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those familiar eyes that now held something I didn't recognize. Sadness, yes, but something else, too. Something that looked almost like warning. The lighthouse beam swept past, plunging the cliff into darkness. When the light returned 3 seconds later, she was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat in the living room, staring at our wedding photo, telling myself it was a dream, a hallucination, a trick of the light and the shadows and the grief that had never fully released its grip on my heart. But it happened again 2 nights later. And again. The night. After that. Always the same spot. Always the same posture. Always that same expression of sorrowful warning. Like she was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I started dreading the darkness. I'd lie awake for hours, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the moment when the lighthouse beam would reveal her standing there again. Sometimes she appeared, sometimes she didn't. The uncertainty was almost worse than the apparitions themselves. After the 5th sighting, I told Melissa. We were sitting in the kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the windows, and I found myself confessing everything. The visions, the fear, the growing conviction that I was losing my mind. Melissa listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand, her expression soft with concern. "Oh, Harry," she said, "why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I thought I was going crazy," I admitted. "I thought if I said it out loud, it would make it real." "You're not crazy." She squeezed my hand. "You're grieving, and grief does strange things to the mind, especially at your age. The isolation doesn't help, being alone in this big house. In this place, so full of memories. It's no wonder you're seeing things. She paused, her brow furrowing. But I do think we should talk to someone. A professional. Just to be safe. A doctor? A specialist. Someone who understands what you're going through. She pulled out her phone. Jack mentioned a colleague of his, a psychiatrist who works with elderly patients experiencing cognitive difficulties. Dr. Victor Hale. He's supposed to be very good. Elderly patients. Cognitive difficulties. The words landed like stones in my stomach. I don't need a psychiatrist, I said. But even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. Of course you don't, Melissa agreed quickly. But it never hurts to get a professional opinion. Just to rule things out. For peace of mind. She was already dialing. I heard her speaking to someone. Her voice low and concerned, using words like hallucinations and memory lapses and progressive deterioration. When she hung up, she smiled at me. That warm, reassuring smile that had become the center of my shrinking world. Dr. Hale can see you Friday, she said. I'll drive you myself. I nodded, too tired to argue. Too confused to question why a preservation specialist had a psychiatrist on speed dial. Too desperate for any explanation that might make the vision stop. That night, I saw Ruth again. She was closer this time, standing not at the cliff's edge but on the path that led to the Maine house. Her hand was raised, pointing at something behind me. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the dark outline of the guest cottage where Melissa slept. When I turned back, Ruth was gone, and I was more afraid than I'd ever been in 40 years of rescue work. Dr. Victor Hale arrived 3 days later with a leather medical bag and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. His handshake was firm, his voice smooth and practiced, the kind of voice that had spent decades delivering bad news in ways that made it sound almost acceptable. Mr. Morrison, he said, settling into the chair across from me in the living room. Jack and Melissa have told me so much about you. It's a pleasure to finally meet. Melissa had prepared tea. She set a cup in front of each of us, then retreated to the corner of the room, her presence a constant reminder that I was being observed. I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties, Dr. Hale continued, pulling a leather notebook from his bag. Memory lapses, visual disturbances, confusion about time and place. I shifted in my seat. When he laid it out like that, stripped of context and emotion, it sounded worse than I'd let myself believe. I've been under a lot of stress, I said. My wife passed away 3 years ago. I've been alone since then. Isolated. Of course. He nodded sympathetically, jotting something in his notebook. Grief can certainly exacerbate cognitive symptoms, but I'd like to run through some basic assessments, if you don't mind, just to get a baseline. The tests felt humiliating. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, to name the current president, to remember a list of 5 words, and repeat them back 15 minutes later. I stumbled on the sevens somewhere around 58. I couldn't remember if it was Tuesday or Wednesday, and when he asked me to recall those 5 words at the end, I could only produce 3. Apple. Sunset. I couldn't remember the others. Dr. Hale's expression remained neutral, but I saw him make several notes, his pen scratching across the paper with quiet efficiency. Tell me about these visions, he said. The ones of your wife, I told him. The cliff, the blue cardigan, the way she'd point at things I couldn't see, the feeling of warning in her eyes. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally writing. When I finished, he set down his pen and leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. Mr. Morrison, I want to be honest with you. What you're describing, the memory lapses, the visual hallucinations, the confusion, these are consistent with early-stage dementia, possibly Alzheimer's disease, though we'd need further testing to confirm. The word hit me like a physical blow. Dementia. The slow erasure of everything that made me who I was. The gradual disappearance of Ruth's face, her voice, the feeling of her hand in mine. That can't be right, I heard myself say. I'm only 68. I was sharp as a tack 6 months ago. Cognitive decline can accelerate rapidly under certain conditions, Dr. Hale explained. Stress, isolation, depression. The loss of a spouse is one of the most significant risk factors we see. He paused. I'd like to recommend a specialized care facility. Somewhere you can receive round-the-clock monitoring and professional support. A nursing home? The words tasted like ash in my mouth. A behavioral health center, he corrected gently. Coastal Haven, in Portland. They specialize in cases exactly like yours. Early intervention, before the symptoms become unmanageable. I looked at Melissa. She was watching me with that expression of tender concern I'd grown so dependent on. It might be for the best, Harry, she said softly. Just until you're stable. Until we know more about what's happening. I don't want to leave my home. My voice cracked. This lighthouse has been in my family for 150 years. I can't just abandon it. No one's asking you to abandon anything, Dr. Hale assured me. This would be temporary. A few weeks, maybe a month, just until we get your symptoms under control. I wanted to argue. I wanted to stand up and tell them both to get out of my house. But the fog was thick that day, pressing down on my thoughts, making everything feel impossibly heavy. And underneath the fog, there was fear. The terrible, paralyzing fear that they were right, that my mind was betraying me, that I was becoming a danger to myself. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course. Dr. Hale smiled, tucking his notebook back into his bag. Take all the time you need. But Mr. Morrison, I would strongly advise against waiting too long. These conditions have a way of progressing faster than we expect. After he left, I sat alone in the living room for hours, staring at Ruth's photograph on the mantel. The woman who had loved me for 37 years. The woman I was slowly, inexorably forgetting. I cried that night. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for Ruth. I cried for myself. I cried for the man I used to be. The rescue swimmer who had never been afraid of anything. Now, terrified of his own mind. And somewhere in the darkness, I could have sworn I heard Ruth's voice. Faint and distant, carried on the wind. Fight, Harry. Don't let them win. But I was too lost in the fog to listen. The first sign that something was truly wrong wasn't the hallucinations. It wasn't the memory lapses or the fog that had settled over my thoughts like a permanent marine layer. It was the silence from my daughter. Emma called every Sunday. She had for 15 years, ever since she'd moved to Boston for college. It didn't matter if she was in the middle of a homicide investigation or buried in paperwork or exhausted from a double shift. Sunday evening, sometime between 6 and 8, my phone would ring, and I'd hear my daughter's voice asking how I was doing, what I'd eaten that week, whether I'd remembered to check the weather stripping on the lighthouse door. After Ruth died, those calls became my lifeline. The one fixed point in a world that had lost its center. The first Sunday Emma didn't call. I assumed she was busy. A big case, maybe. She'd mentioned something about a series of break-ins in Beacon Hill the last time we'd spoken. The second Sunday, I tried calling her. The phone rang 5 times, then went to voicemail. Emma, it's Dad. Just checking in. Call me when you get a chance. Love you. She didn't call back. By the third Sunday, I was worried enough to mention it to Melissa. I'm sure she's just swamped, Melissa said, refilling my tea. She'd taken to managing my meals entirely now, preparing everything from breakfast to dinner, always with that same gentle efficiency. Jack mentioned she's been working a major case, something about organized crime. She probably can't talk about it. She always finds time to call, I insisted, even during the worst cases. Melissa patted my hand. I'll have Jack reach out. He'll make sure she knows you're worried. Jack came by that evening, and I asked him directly, "Emma's fine, Dad." He didn't quite meet my eyes. "She's just buried in work. You know how it is. She asked me to tell you she loves you, and she'll call as soon as things calm down. Can I have her new number?" Maybe she changed phones. "It's the same number, Dad." A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation? Impatience? "Look, I know you miss her, but she's a grown woman with a demanding job. You can't expect her to drop everything every Sunday just to chat." The words stung more than he probably intended. Or maybe he intended them exactly that much. After Jack left, I tried calling Emma again. This time, the phone didn't even ring. It went straight to a message saying the number was no longer in service. I stared at the screen, confusion swirling through the fog in my mind. How could her number be disconnected? She'd had the same number for a decade. "Melissa," I called out. "Something's wrong with Emma's phone. It says the number's been disconnected." Melissa appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "That's strange. Maybe she got a new phone for work. Security reasons. Jack would know." But when I asked Jack the next day, he brushed it off. "I'll look into it, Dad. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." The phrase became a refrain over the following weeks. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. You're just confused. Other people stopped calling too. Sam O'Brien, my old first mate, who used to drop by every few weeks to share a beer and swap sea stories. Margaret Chen, a neighbor from down the coast who'd known Ruth since childhood. Even Father Patrick from Street Ann's, who'd called monthly since Ruth's funeral to check on me. One by one, the voices in my life went silent. I tried calling Sam once. Melissa answered my phone before I could finish dialing. "Harry, you need to rest. The doctor said too much stimulation isn't good for your condition. I just want to talk to Sam." 5 minutes. "Sam's been traveling," she said smoothly. "His daughter mentioned it last week. He won't be back until spring." It was October. Spring was 6 months away. I tried to argue, but the fog made it hard to hold on to thoughts. They'd slip away, like water through my fingers, leaving me grasping at nothing. It wasn't until weeks later, when the fog finally began to lift, that I realized the truth. I hadn't spoken to anyone outside that lighthouse, anyone who wasn't Jack or Melissa, in over a month. They hadn't just isolated me. They'd made me disappear. And the worst part? I'd helped them do it. I'd swallowed their pills and believed their lies and let them cut me off from everyone who might have noticed something was wrong. Ruth had tried to warn me. Those visions, those ghostly appearances at the cliff's edge, pointing toward the cottage, pointing toward danger. I just hadn't understood what she was saying. Not yet. They say a man's signature is his word, his bond, the mark he leaves on the world to say, "I was here, and I meant this." Mine was being used to sign away everything I'd ever worked for, and I didn't even know it. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, about 3 months after Melissa had moved into the cottage. Jack arrived unannounced, which had become his habit lately. He'd show up with coffee and pastries from that bakery in Rockport, the one Ruth used to love, acting like a dutiful son checking on his aging father. "Dad, I need you to sign some papers," he said, spreading a stack of documents across the kitchen table. "The preservation assessment is moving forward, and there's some legal paperwork we need to file." I stared at the pages. The words swam in front of my eyes, refusing to stay in focus. The fog was particularly thick that day. I'd taken my supplements an hour earlier, and my thoughts felt like they were wrapped in cotton. What kind of paperwork? Historic preservation permits. Insurance updates. Nothing major. Jack uncapped a pen and placed it in my hand. "Just sign where the tabs are. Melissa and I have reviewed everything. It's all standard." I should have read them. I should have demanded to see a lawyer. I should have called Emma, if I could even figure out how to reach her anymore. But the fog was so heavy, and Jack was being so kind, and I was so tired of fighting against the confusion that had become my constant companion. I signed, page after page, Yellow tab after yellow tab. My signature, the same one I'd used on rescue reports for 40 years, scratched across documents I couldn't comprehend. Jack collected each page as I finished, stacking them neatly, sliding them into a leather folder before I could think to ask for copies. "That's the last one," he said, snapping the folder shut. "Thanks, Dad. This really helps move things along." He was gone within the hour. I sat at the kitchen table long after he left, staring at the space where those documents had been, trying to remember what I'd just agreed to. I couldn't. The details slipped away, like water, through a storm drain. 3 days later, I found the receipt. I wasn't looking for it. I'd gone to the study to find my reading glasses, the ones Ruth used to tease me about losing. The study had always been my space, my sanctuary. Ruth had decorated the rest of the house. But this room was mine, filled with maritime maps and rescue memorabilia and photographs of the people I'd pulled from the sea. The receipt was crumpled at the bottom of the wastebasket. A small piece of paper that would have meant nothing if I hadn't happened to smooth it out. Wire transfer confirmation. Morrison Family Trust to Coastal Development Partners, LLC. Amount: $200,000. The date was 3 days ago. The same day Jack had me sign those papers. I read it twice. 3 times. Waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. $200,000. Transferred from my trust, the account Ruth and I had built over decades of careful saving, to a company I'd never heard of. The fog lifted. Just for a moment. Like the sun breaking through a storm cloud, burning away the confusion with sudden, terrible clarity. I hadn't signed preservation permits. I hadn't signed insurance updates. I'd signed something else entirely. My hands shook as I carried the receipt to the kitchen and tucked it into the back of the cookbook Ruth had given me on our first anniversary. Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Melissa never touched it. She said she preferred her own recipes. That night, I didn't take my supplements. I told Melissa I'd already taken them, swallowed dry while she was in the bathroom. She smiled and said goodnight and retreated to her cottage. Oblivious, I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, feeling the fog thin with every passing hour. Something was very, very wrong. I didn't know what yet. Didn't know the full scope of what my son had planned, what he'd already taken, what he still intended to steal. But for the first time in months, I was awake enough to start asking questions, and I was terrified of what the answers might be. The pills were small, green, and supposedly for my heart. That's what Melissa told me when she switched the supplements 2 weeks ago. Dr. Hale's recommendation, she said. A new formulation to help with circulation and cognitive function. Take 2 in the morning, 2 at night. But the only thing they were doing to my heart was breaking it. After finding that receipt, I made a decision. I would stop taking everything they gave me. No more herbal supplements. No more heart pills. No more of the vitamins Melissa crushed into my morning oatmeal when she thought I wasn't looking. The first day without the pills was agony. My hands trembled. My head pounded. Sweat soaked through my shirts. And I spent half the night in the bathroom, my body purging whatever chemicals had been building up in my system for months. Melissa noticed something was wrong. She hovered more than usual, pressing her palm to my forehead, asking if I needed to see Dr. Hale again. Just a stomach bug, I told her, forcing a weak smile. Probably that fish chowder from yesterday. She looked skeptical but didn't push. Maybe she thought the symptoms were just the dementia progressing. Maybe she thought I was finally breaking down completely. She had no idea I was breaking free. By the 3rd day, the worst of the withdrawal had passed. By the 5th day, I could think in complete sentences again, could hold a thought from one moment to the next without it dissolving into mist. By the end of the 1st week, I remembered everything. The receipt wasn't an isolated incident. As the fog lifted, other memories surfaced, sharp and clear and damning. The stack of papers Jack had me sign, The conversations Melissa had on her phone late at night, her voice low and urgent, using words like timeline and commitment, and before he figures it out, the way Jack had looked at me the day Dr. Hale delivered his diagnosis. Not worried. Not sad. Satisfied. I started keeping a mental list of inconsistencies. Things that hadn't made sense at the time, but now formed a terrible pattern. Melissa knew the lighthouse's history too well. She'd rattled off construction dates and renovation details that weren't in any public record, information she could only have gotten from Jack, or from documents she shouldn't have had access to. Dr. Hale had arrived too quickly, too prepared. He'd had his diagnosis ready before he'd finished his tests, almost as if he'd known what he was going to find before he walked through the door. And Emma, my Emma, who had called every Sunday for 15 years, who had cried at her mother's funeral and sworn she'd never let me face anything alone. She hadn't abandoned me. She couldn't have. Someone had cut me off from her, and there was only one person with enough access to my phone, my contacts, my entire life to do it. I started pretending. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder than any rescue mission, any midnight swim through freezing water. I had to act foggy when my mind was sharp, had to stumble over words I remembered perfectly, had to look confused when Melissa explained things for the third time, nodding vaguely, playing the part of the declining old man they wanted me to be. Every morning, Melissa brought my pills with a glass of water. Every morning, I tucked them under my tongue, took a sip, and smiled gratefully. Every morning, I spat them into my hand the moment she turned away and flushed them down the toilet. The visions of Ruth stopped. Or rather, they changed. I still saw her sometimes, standing at the edge of the cliff or watching me through the lighthouse window. But now, her expression was different. Not warning anymore, encouraging. "I see you, Harry," she seemed to say. "I see you waking up. Now fight." And I intended to. But I needed proof. I needed to understand exactly what Jack and Melissa were planning, how deep this conspiracy went, and whether anyone else was involved. Most importantly, I needed to find a way to contact Emma, to let her know I was alive. I was aware, and I desperately needed her help. I was a rescue swimmer for 40 years. I'd saved 347 lives by staying calm in impossible situations, by reading the water and the wind, by waiting for the exact right moment to act. This was no different. Just another rescue mission. Except this time, the person drowning was me. Sam O'Brien showed up on a Tuesday morning, exactly 12 days after I'd stopped taking Melissa's pills. I watched him through the kitchen window, 72 years old, still built like the lobsterman he'd been for 5 decades, walking up the gravel path with a cooler in one hand and a 6-pack of Moxie soda in the other. "Harry Morrison," he called out, his voice cutting through the November wind. "I brought you some of Margaret's clam chowder. She says you've been looking thin." Melissa intercepted him at the door before I could move. I stayed in the kitchen, listening. "Mr. O'Brien, Harry isn't feeling well today. Perhaps another time?" "Num is the 17 with their conspice. Num. Nonsense. I've known Harry since we were pulling lobster traps at 16. He's never too sick for Margaret's chowder." I shuffled to the doorway, making sure to keep my movements slow, my expression vacant. The act was getting easier now. "Sam? Is that you?" His weathered face broke into a smile, but I saw the concern flicker behind his eyes. He knew something was wrong. Sam O'Brien had pulled drowning men from 30-foot swells. He could read trouble the way other people read newspapers. "There he is. Come on, Harry. Let's sit on the porch, like old times." Melissa started to object, but Sam was already guiding me outside. She had no choice but to follow, positioning herself on the steps where she could hear everything we said. We sat in the wooden rockers that Ruth had painted white every spring. Sam handed me a Moxie, and for several minutes we just watched the ocean, the way we'd done 1,000 times before. "Emma called me," he said quietly, his voice barely above the wind. "4 days ago. She's worried about you, Harry. Says she can't reach you. Says your number's been disconnected. My heart lurched, but I kept my face blank. Melissa was 12 feet away, close enough to hear raised voices but not whispers. I can't remember. I let confusion creep into my voice. Sam leaned closer, pretending to adjust my jacket collar. She gave me a message. Said to tell you, the lighthouse keeper always finds his way home. She said, you'd understand. I understood perfectly. It was a phrase Ruth used to say whenever I went out on dangerous rescues. Emma was telling me she knew I was in trouble, and she was coming. She also said. Sam's voice dropped even lower. Don't trust the doctor. Don't trust the woman. And when the time comes, there's a phone taped under the third step of the widow's walk. Emma put it there 2 weeks ago. A phone. Emma had been here. She'd seen what was happening, and she'd left me a lifeline. I brought you something else, Sam said at normal volume, reaching into the cooler. He pulled out a jar of Margaret's pickled vegetables and pressed it into my hands. Margaret's special recipe. She said to keep it by your bed. I felt something solid inside the jar, hidden among the vegetables. Later, alone in my room, I would discover a waterproof notepad and a pen tools for documenting everything. Melissa appeared at my elbow. Harry, you should rest now. You know what Dr. Hale said about overexertion. Sam stood, but not before gripping my hand with the strength of 50 years of friendship. Take care of yourself, old friend. I'll be back. And Harry. He looked directly into my eyes. The tide always turns. I watched him walk away, carrying with him the first real hope I'd felt in months. Emma knew. She was working on something, and now I had allies, tools, and a hidden phone waiting for me on the widow's walk. That night, after Melissa's footsteps retreated to her cottage, I stood at my bedroom window watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the dark water. Ruth appeared on the east cliff. But this time, she wasn't pointing and warning. She was smiling. The rescue operation had begun. But the most dangerous part was still ahead because I had to keep pretending to drown while secretly learning to swim. 300 miles south, in a cramped office on the 4th floor of Boston Police Department's Homicide Division, my daughter Emma was doing what she did best, following the money. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. The coffee in her mug had gone cold twice, and the whiteboard behind her desk looked like the work of a conspiracy theorist. Red strings connected photographs, bank statements, and property records in a web that grew more disturbing with every hour. It had started with a simple question. Why couldn't she reach her father? Emma had called the phone company first. The representative confirmed that Harold Morrison's landline had been disconnected at the request of an authorized family member, Jack Morrison, citing the account holder's cognitive decline. His cell phone showed the same pattern. Someone had ported the number to a new device, effectively hijacking all incoming calls. That was illegal. That was also her brother. She'd driven to Rockport 2 weeks ago, parking half a mile from the lighthouse and approaching through the woods like she was surveilling a suspect. What she saw through her binoculars made her stomach turn. Her father, moving slowly across the yard, his eyes unfocused, while a woman she'd never seen before guided him by the elbow. Emma had watched for 3 hours. She counted the pills her father took. She noted the woman's routine. And when darkness fell, she crept onto the property and taped a burner phone under the 3rd step of the widow's walk, the hiding spot she and her father had used for secret notes when she was a child. Back in Boston, she'd started digging. Jack's financial records were a disaster. Her brother owed $1.2 million to various creditors, credit cards maxed out, a second mortgage on his Portland condo, and 3 personal loans from increasingly questionable sources. The most recent loan, for $400,000, came from a company called Pacific Rim Investments. Emma traced Pacific Rim through 7 shell corporations across 4 countries. The trail ended at a name that made her blood run cold. Chen Wei. Chen Wei was a ghost in law enforcement databases mentioned in connection with money laundering, real estate fraud, and elder exploitation schemes across the Pacific Northwest, but never charged. His operations were sophisticated, targeting elderly property owners with valuable coastal land. The pattern was always the same: befriend, isolate, medicate, and manipulate the victim into signing over assets before committing them to a long-term care facility where they would conveniently deteriorate. The woman at the Lighthouse, Melissa Crane, didn't exist before 2019. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history. Her social security number belonged to a woman who had died in Seattle in 2018. Emma found one photograph of Melissa in a property record from 2021. She was standing next to Chen Wei at a groundbreaking ceremony for a luxury resort in Oregon. The caption identified her as development coordinator, but it was the resemblance that stopped Emma's breath. The same cheekbones, the same distinctive jawline. Melissa Crane wasn't just working for Chen Wei. She was his daughter. Emma pulled up the plans for the Morrison Lighthouse property. Someone had already filed preliminary permits for a 30-unit boutique hotel development. The applicant was Coastal Development Partners LLC, the same company that had received the $200,000 wire transfer from her father's trust account. The pieces assembled themselves with horrifying clarity. Jack was in debt to Chen Wei. Chen Wei wanted the Lighthouse property for development. Melissa had been planted to gain Harry's trust and document his cognitive decline. Victor Hale, whose medical license had been suspended twice for ethics violations, would provide the diagnosis needed to have Harry committed. Once Harry was locked away in Coastal Haven, Jack would have power of attorney. And Harry Morrison would spend his remaining years drugged into oblivion in a facility designed to keep him quiet. Emma picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Her contact at the FBI's Elder Fraud Division answered on the second ring. "I need to report a crime in progress," she said, "and I need a team in Rockport, Maine within 72 hours. She looked at the photograph of her father on her desk, taken at her academy graduation. His smile proud and bright. "Hold on, Dad," she whispered. "I'm coming." And for May, Dade, and whispered. The widow's walk was 37 steps above my bedroom, a narrow platform circling the lighthouse tower where generations of Morrison women had watched for their husbands' ships. Ruth used to stand there every evening. I was out on a rescue, her silhouette visible against the sunset. I waited until 3 a.m., when Melissa's cottage had been dark for 4 hours, and Jack's rental car was gone. He'd driven back to Portland 2 days ago, probably to report our progress to whoever was pulling his strings. The stairs creaked under my weight. Every sound felt like a gunshot in the silence. But I'd climbed these steps 10,000 times in 40 years, and I knew exactly which boards to avoid. The third step from the top had a loose corner that Ruth had always meant to fix. I knelt down, my knees protesting against the cold wood, and felt along the underside until my fingers touched plastic. A phone. Fully charged. Emma had thought of everything. I powered it on and found a single saved contact. E. There was also a text message, dated 2 weeks ago. "Don't call unless emergency. Text only. They may be monitoring. I'm working on it. I love you, Dad." My hands trembled as I typed my response. "I'm here. I'm okay. I stopped the pills. I know what they're planning. I need proof." The reply came within minutes, despite the hour. "Camera. Hide it somewhere they talk. Get them on video. FBI needs evidence. Sam has equipment. I love you." The next morning, I shuffled into the kitchen with my best confused expression. "Melissa? I can't find my reading glasses." She helped me search, her patience performative, her smile never reaching her eyes. I watched her carefully now, seeing the predator beneath the caretaker's mask. Every kindness was calculated. Every gentle touch was part of the trap. Sam returned 3 days later with another cooler of Margaret's cooking. This time, hidden beneath a container of beef stew, was a small black device no bigger than a button, a wireless camera with a 7-2-hour battery and motion-activated recording. "High definition," Sam whispered while Melissa was in the bathroom. "Audio too. Connects to a secure cloud. Emma can access it from Boston. The question was where to hide it. Jack and Melissa had their most important conversations in the living room, usually late at night, when they thought I was asleep. But the room was sparse, few places to conceal anything. Then I remembered Ruth's portrait. It hung above the fireplace, painted by a local artist, the year we celebrated our 40th anniversary. Ruth sat in her favorite chair, wearing the blue cardigan she'd had since our honeymoon, her eyes warm with decades of shared memories. The ornate frame had deep carvings, leaves, and waves intertwined, with plenty of shadows to hide a small camera. That night, I climbed onto a chair at 2 a.m. and carefully wedged the device into the frame's decorative corner. The lens pointed directly at the couch, where Jack always sat. The angle captured most of the room. "Watch over me, Ruth," I whispered to the portrait. "Help me catch them." I tested the feed by waving at the camera, then checked the phone. The image was crystal clear, an old man standing in his living room, surrounded by the possessions of a lifetime, fighting to keep them from being stolen. 2 days later, my patience was rewarded. Jack arrived unannounced on a Friday evening. I heard his car pull up and immediately retreated to my bedroom, leaving the door cracked just enough to hear voices drifting up from below. "The timelines moved up," Jack said. "Chen Wei wants the property transferred by the end of the month. The buyers from Shanghai are getting impatient. Your father's not deteriorating fast enough," Melissa replied. "Dr. Hale says we need at least 2 more documented episodes before the commitment papers will hold up. Then make him deteriorate faster. Increase the dosage. I don't care how you do it, just get it done." There was a pause. When Melissa spoke again, her voice was cold. "And if he doesn't survive the increased dosage, then we inherit everything anyway." Problem solved. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. My own son. My firstborn child. The boy I'd taught to fish, to sail, to read the weather in the clouds. He was discussing my murder like it was a business transaction. In Ruth's portrait, the camera recorded everything. The footage from Ruth's portrait changed everything. Emma called me at 4 a.m., 2 days after Jack's visit. I'd crept up to the widow's walk with the burner phone, the November wind cutting through my robe like frozen knives. "Dad, are you somewhere safe to talk? I'm on the widow's walk. They can't hear me up here." Her voice was tight with controlled fury. "I've watched the recording 17 times. We have Jack on camera discussing your potential death. That's conspiracy to commit murder. But Dad, there's more." She told me what she'd found. The camera had captured something I'd missed while hiding in my bedroom. After Jack left that night, Melissa had made a phone call. She'd spoken in Mandarin. But Emma had sent the audio to a translator at the bureau. She called Chen Wei directly, Emma said. She called him father. "Dad, she's not just working for him, she's his daughter. Her real name is Chen Mei Lin. She changed it to Melissa Crane in 2019. After Chen Wei's operation in Seattle got too much attention. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white against the cold metal. The woman who had been feeding me pills, cooking my meals, pretending to care about my well-being, she was the daughter of a criminal empire. There's something else," Emma continued. "Something that connects all of this in a way I never expected." She paused, and I heard her take a breath. "Do you remember Sophie Chen? The little girl Mom saved 3 years ago?" The name hit me like a rogue wave. Sophie Chen, 7 years old. The child Ruth had died rescuing from the East Cliff. Of course I remember. Sophie Chen is Chen Wei's granddaughter, Melissa's niece. The world tilted beneath my feet. I had to sit down on the cold platform, my back against the lighthouse wall, trying to process what Emma was telling me. "That wasn't an accident," I whispered. "Ruth's death wasn't an accident. We don't know that for certain yet." But Dad Chen Wei's interest in the Morrison Lighthouse started exactly 3 months after Mom died. The first permit inquiry for the property came from one of his shell companies in April of that year. I thought about the timeline. Ruth dies in January, saving Chen Wei's granddaughter. 3 months later, Chen Wei starts researching my property. 6 months after that, Jack's gambling debts suddenly ballooned to $1.2 million debts owed to Chen Wei's investment company. A year later, Jack introduces me to Melissa. He planned this, I said. He's been planning this for 3 years. It gets worse. Emma's voice dropped. I pulled the autopsy report on Sophie Chen's mother, Chen Wei's daughter-in-law. She died in 2020, officially from a prescription drug interaction. The same cocktail of medications that Melissa has been giving you. My blood turned to ice. The FBI is building a RICO case, Emma continued. Chen Wei's operation spans 6 states. They've identified at least 15 elderly victims who were drugged, committed to facilities, and had their assets stripped. 3 of them died within months of being institutionalized. Dad, you're not his first target. You might not even be his primary target. The Lighthouse property is valuable. But this is about something bigger. What do you mean? Chen Wei is laundering money through real estate development. The resort he wants to build on your land? It's not about hotel revenue. It's about moving tens of millions of dollars from overseas investors through legitimate American property. Your lighthouse is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I stared out at the dark ocean, the beam from my lighthouse sweeping across the waves every 30 seconds. 4 generations of Morrisons had kept this light burning. We'd guided ships through storms, saved drowning sailors, served as a beacon of hope on this dangerous coast. And now my own son had sold that legacy to a criminal who might have orchestrated my wife's death. Emma, I said quietly. What happened to Sophie? After Ruth saved her? She lives with her father now, Chen Wei's son, David Chen. He cut ties with his family after his wife's death. Moved to California. He doesn't know about any of this. I thought about that little girl, now 10 years old, growing up without a mother, just like my children had grown up without Ruth. 2 families destroyed by the same man. When does the FBI move? 72 hours. Maybe less. Dad, I need you to hold on just a little longer. Can you do that? I looked up at Ruth's lighthouse, her light still sweeping across the darkness. I've been holding on for 3 years, I said. What's another 3 days? The weatherman called it a historic nor'easter, the kind of storm that fishermen in Rockport still talked about decades later. Winds up to 90 miles per hour, waves cresting at 40 feet. A storm surge that would swallow the lower cliffs whole. I'd seen storms like this before. In 40 years of rescue work, I'd pulled bodies from the water after 3 of them. The ocean didn't negotiate. It didn't show mercy. It simply took what it wanted. The storm was scheduled to hit in 48 hours, exactly when the FBI planned to move. Emma called with the news, her voice strained. The operation is still on, but the Coast Guard is grounding all helicopters. We'll have to come by land, which means the roads could be impassable if the storm hits early. What are you saying? I'm saying you might be on your own for longer than we planned. The team is staging in Portland, but if Route 1 floods, they won't reach Rockport until the storm passes. That could be 12 hours, maybe more. 12 hours alone with Jack and Melissa, knowing what I knew. Pretending to be the confused old man they thought I was. I can handle it, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Melissa noticed the storm preparations too. She spent that afternoon securing the cottage, moving her car to higher ground, and stockpiling supplies. But there was something else in her movements, an urgency that had nothing to do with weather. That evening, I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. The timeline has to move up. The storm is perfect cover. If something happens during a nor'easter, no one will question it. Natural causes. An accident. The old man wandered outside in confusion, and the waves took him. She paused, listening. Yes, Father. I understand. Jack will be here tomorrow morning. We'll have the papers signed before the storm hits. If he refuses. Another pause. Then we proceed with the alternative. The alternative. They weren't even pretending anymore. The storm would provide the perfect cover for my death. A confused, elderly man with dementia, wandering outside during a historic nor'easter. Tragic, but not suspicious. I texted Emma immediately. They're moving tonight or tomorrow. Storm is cover. They plan to kill me. Her response came in 30 seconds. Do not confront them. Stay in your room. Lock the door. I'm moving the team up. We'll be there by dawn. Dawn. That was 14 hours away. The sky began to darken that afternoon, clouds rolling in from the northeast like a black tide. The barometric pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. The lighthouse beacon seemed dimmer against the growing darkness, its beams swallowed by the thickening air. Jack arrived at 6 p.m., earlier than expected. I watched from my bedroom window as he parked his car and sprinted through the first gusts of wind to the Maine house. He was carrying a briefcase, the same one he'd brought when I signed away $200,000. I retreated to my bed, pulling the covers up, keeping my breathing slow and regular. The confused old man, harmless and helpless. An hour later, there was a knock on my door. "Dad?" Jack's voice was falsely cheerful. "Melissa made dinner. Why don't you come down and eat with us? We should all be together during the storm." "I'm tired," I called back, adding a quaver to my voice. "Maybe later." A pause. Then, footsteps retreating down the stairs. I checked the burner phone. Emma had sent another message. "Team departing Portland now. ETA 6 a.m. Weather deteriorating. Stay hidden. I love you." Outside, the wind began to howl. The old lighthouse groaned against the gusts, timbers creaking in protest. Rain started to lash against the windows. Horizontal sheets of water driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds. I thought about Ruth, standing on this same spot during storms, watching for my rescue boat to return. She'd never worried about herself, only about me, about our children, about the sailors we were trying to save. Now our daughter was out there in this storm, racing to save me. At 11 p.m., the power went out. The lighthouse had backup generators for the beacon, but the house plunged into darkness. I heard Melissa's voice downstairs, speaking to Jack in rapid Mandarin. I didn't need a translator to understand the tone. They were preparing to make their move. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see the lighthouse beam still sweeping across the churning sea. Ruth's light, still burning. I reached under my mattress and pulled out the notepad Sam had given me, flipping to the page where I'd written everything. Dates, amounts, names, conversations, evidence that would survive even if I didn't. Then I tucked it back into its hiding spot and waited for dawn. The storm was here. And so was the final reckoning. The knock came at 2:07 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been watching the burner phone's clock for hours, counting the minutes until dawn like a prisoner counting days to release. 7 hours had become 4, then 3, and I'd started to believe I might actually survive this night. Then the knock. 3 sharp raps against my bedroom door. "Dad?" Jack's voice was different, now harder, stripped of the false warmth he'd been performing for months. "We need to talk. Open the door." I didn't move. Didn't breathe. "Dad, I know you're awake. I can see the light from your phone under the door." Stupid. I'd been careless. I shoved the burner phone under my pillow and called back in my best confused voice. "Jack? Is that you? What time is it? Is the storm over?" "The storm's getting worse. That's why we need to talk." "In case something happens to you?" he meant. "In case we need to explain why your body washed up on the rocks." "I'm so tired, son." "Can't it wait until morning?" A long pause. Then I heard Melissa's voice, low and urgent, speaking to Jack in the hallway. I couldn't make out the words over the howling wind, but the tone was clear. She was telling him to stop playing games. "Dad." Jack's voice was cold now. "Open the door. Now." This was it. The moment I'd been dreading since Emma's first phone call. I had 2 choices. Open the door and face whatever they had planned, or barricade myself in and pray the FBI arrived before Jack broke through. I chose the phone. My fingers trembled as I typed. "They're at my door. Jack, demanding I open. What do I do? Emma's response came instantly, as if she'd been holding the phone waiting. Don't open. Barricade the door. We're 45 minutes out. Coast Guard agreed to fly despite weather. Hold on, Dad. I'm coming. 45 minutes. I just had to survive 45 minutes. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The old oak dresser, the one Ruth and I had bought at an antique shop in Camden 40 years ago, stood against the wall. It weighed at least 200 pounds, filled with sweaters and photographs and memories. I pushed it in front of the door, my shoulders screaming in protest. The dresser scraped against the floor with a sound like thunder. What are you doing in there? Jack's voice rose. Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the wooden chair from Ruth's old writing desk and wedged it under the doorknob. Then I pushed the bed frame against the dresser for good measure. The pounding started immediately. Open this door! Jack was shouting now, all pretense abandoned. Dad, you don't understand what's happening. We're trying to help you. By killing me? The words came out before I could stop them. By drowning me in the storm and calling it an accident? Silence. Then Jack's voice, quieter but somehow more terrifying. You heard that. I heard everything. The camera in Ruth's portrait recorded every word. Emma has the footage. The FBI has the footage. It's over, Jack. More silence. Then footsteps retreating down the hall. I heard Jack and Melissa arguing, their voices rising and falling like the waves outside. Words drifted up through the floor. Knows everything. FBI. We have to go. No. We finish this. 5 minutes later, the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stop at my door. They continued up. Toward the lighthouse tower, I heard the heavy door at the base of the tower creak open, then slam shut against the wind. They were climbing the spiral stairs 137 steps to the top, where the beacon still swept its light across the storm-torn sea. Why would they go up there? Then I understood. The lighthouse controls. The backup generator. The beacon that had guided ships safely past these rocks for 150 years. They were going to kill the light. If a ship went down tonight, if people died because the Morrison Lighthouse went dark for the first time in a century, I would be blamed. The confused old man with dementia who forgot to maintain the generator. Another tragedy to add to my supposed mental decline. And in the chaos that followed, no one would question if I wandered outside and drowned. I looked at the barricaded door, then at the window. The widow's walk was directly above me, accessible by the external fire ladder that Ruth had insisted we install after the Thompson Lighthouse fire in 1987. The wind was screaming at 90 miles per hour. The rain was horizontal. Going outside in this storm was suicide. And this storm, the tinge of chapper, but letting that light go dark was not an option. I opened the window, and the storm rushed in like a living thing. The wind nearly tore me from the ladder on the first rung. I clung to the rusted metal with hands that had pulled drowning men from 30-foot swells. My body pressed flat against the lighthouse wall. The rain hit like needles, each drop driven by 90-mile-per-hour gusts until it felt like standing under a fire hose filled with ice water. 37 rungs to the widow's walk. I counted each one, the way I used to count strokes when swimming through riptides. 1, 2, 3. Don't think about the wind. 4, 5, 6. Don't think about the 100-foot drop to the rocks below. By the time I reached the widow's walk, my arms were shaking and my lungs burned with every breath. The platform was slick with rain, the railing barely visible through the sheets of water. Above me, the lighthouse beacon still swept its beam across the darkness, but even as I watched, it flickered. They were already at the generator. The door to the tower was 10 feet away. I crawled across the widow's walk on hands and knees, the wind threatening to lift me over the railing with every gust. When I finally reached the door, I found it unlocked. They hadn't expected anyone to follow them up here. The spiral staircase inside was dark, except for the emergency lights, dim red bulbs that cast everything in the color of blood. I could hear voices above me, echoing down the stone walls. "Just pull the fuel line," Melissa was saying. "Make it look like mechanical failure. The old man forgot to maintain it. He'll try to fix it." Jack replied. "He knows this lighthouse better than anyone. Then we make sure he can't fix anything. Ever again." I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could. But at 68 years old, with joints that ached in cold weather and lungs still burning from the climb, silence was impossible. My foot scraped against a step. The voices above went silent. "Dad?" Jack's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Is that you?" I didn't answer. I kept climbing. The lantern room at the top of the lighthouse was a circle of glass and steel, the massive Fresnel lens rotating slowly in the center, its beam cutting through the storm like a sword of light. The generator hummed in the mechanical room below, but I could see the fuel gauge from here. Someone had already drained half the tank. Jack stood by the control panel, a wrench in his hand. Melissa was beside him, her face a mask of cold calculation that bore no resemblance to the caring woman who had fed me pills and called me Mr. Morrison. "You shouldn't have come up here," Jack said. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, or maybe something I'd always refused to see. Desperation, greed, the willingness to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. "This is my lighthouse," I said. My voice came out stronger than I expected. 4 generations of Morrisons have kept this light burning. You think I'm going to let you kill it? It's just a building, Dad. A pile of bricks and glass. It's worth $4 million to the right buyer. It's worth more than that. It's worth more than you'll ever understand. Melissa stepped forward, and I saw she was holding something, a syringe filled with clear liquid. "We can do this the easy way, Mr. Morrison. 1 injection, and you'll simply go to sleep. You won't feel anything when the waves take you. Like your mother's victims?" I kept my eyes on the syringe. Emma told me about the others. 15 elderly people drugged and robbed, 3 of them dead. Your father's been running this scheme for years. For the first time, I saw something flicker in Melissa's expression. Surprise, maybe, or fear. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know your real name is Chen Mei Lin. I know your father is Chen Wei. And I know that 3 years ago, my wife died saving your niece from these same cliffs." The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, the syringe trembling in her hand. "Sophie," she whispered. "Ruth pulled her from the water. Ruth died, so that little girl could live. And this is how your family repays that sacrifice? By stealing from me? By trying to kill me?" I didn't know. Melissa's voice cracked. "I didn't know about Ruth until after I got here. My father never told me." "Enough." Jack's voice was sharp. He stepped toward me, the wrench raised. "We don't have time for this. The FBI is coming. We need to finish this and get out before—" The lighthouse beacon flickered again, then died. In the sudden darkness, I moved. 40 years of rescue training took over muscle memory that hadn't faded despite the months of fog and confusion. I grabbed Jack's wrist as the wrench came down, twisted, and felt the tool clatter to the floor. My son was younger and stronger, but I knew this lighthouse. I knew every corner, every shadow, every step. We struggled in the darkness, his hands finding my throat, my elbow finding his ribs. Melissa screamed something in Mandarin. The storm howled outside, shaking the glass walls of the lantern room. Then I heard it, the distant thump of helicopter blades cutting through the wind. Emma was here. Jack's hands were around my throat when the searchlight hit us. A beam of white light brighter than the lighthouse had ever been cut through the glass walls of the lantern room, turning the darkness into blinding day. The Coast Guard helicopter hovered impossibly close to the tower, its blades fighting the 90-mile-per-hour winds, its spotlight pinning us like specimens under a microscope. Jack's grip loosened. For one moment, we both stared at the helicopter, at the figure in the open door, wearing a tactical vest, her dark hair whipping in the rotor wash. "Emma, FBI! Step away from him! Now!" Her voice came through a bullhorn, cutting through the storm like a knife. Behind her, I could see other figures, agents in body armor, weapons drawn. Jack released me and stumbled backward. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the helicopter and the stairwell, calculating escape routes that didn't exist. "It's over, Jack," I said, my voice raw from his grip. "There's nowhere to go. Shut up." He was still holding the wrench, his knuckles white. "This is your fault. All of this. If you'd just signed the papers, if you'd just gone to that facility like you were supposed to, if I'd just died quietly so you could steal everything I built." The helicopter shifted position, and the searchlight caught Melissa. She was pressed against the wall, the syringe still in her hand, her face streaked with tears I hadn't noticed before. "Chen Mei-Lin!" Emma's voice boomed through the bullhorn. "Drop the weapon and put your hands on your head." Melissa looked at the syringe as if seeing it for the first time. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. Not the cold calculation of a predator. Something else. Something broken. "I didn't know about your wife," she said quietly. "My father never told me. When I found out, I wanted to stop. I tried to convince him to let you go, but he said it was too late. He said we were too deep. You could have walked away. You don't walk away from my father." Her voice was hollow. "Nobody walks away from Chen Wei." She dropped the syringe and raised her hands. The glass cylinder shattered on the floor, the clear liquid spreading across the metal grating. Jack watched her surrender with disbelief, turning to rage. "What are you doing? We can still get out of this. There's the boat. We can take the coast road." "It's over, Jack." Melissa's voice was tired. "Can't you see? It was over the moment your sister started investigating. Maybe it was over the moment your mother died, saving Sophie. Karma has a long memory." The helicopter was descending now, the pilot fighting the wind to find a landing spot on the rocky ground below. I could see Emma preparing to rappel down my daughter, my detective, coming to save her father the way I'd saved hundreds of strangers over 40 years. Jack lunged for the stairwell. I didn't think. I just moved. My shoulder caught him in the chest, driving him backward against the control panel. He was younger, stronger, but I had desperation on my side and 40 years of wrestling the ocean for human lives. We fell together, crashing into the dead generator. Pain exploded in my hip, my shoulder, my ribs. Jack scrambled on top of me, the wrench raised high. "You ruined everything," he screamed. "You and your lighthouse and your legacy. I spent my whole life in your shadow. The great Harry Morrison, hero of Rockport. Well, guess what, Dad? Heroes D2. The wrench came down. I closed my eyes. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. When I opened my eyes, Jack was clutching his shoulder, the wrench clattering away across the floor. Emma stood in the doorway, her service weapon still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "Jack Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, wire fraud, and about 15 other charges I'll think of on the way down." Behind her, FBI agents poured into the lantern room, securing Jack, handcuffing Melissa, calling for medical support. Someone else was checking my vitals, asking if I could hear them, if I knew where I was, but I only had eyes for my daughter. Emma holstered her weapon and crossed the room in 3 steps. She dropped to her knees beside me, her arms wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I've got you, Dad," she whispered. Outside, the storm still raged. The lighthouse beacon was still dark, but for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel: safe. I looked up at Ruth's light, waiting to shine again, and I could have sworn I saw her standing in the corner of the lantern room. She was smiling, her blue cardigan bright against the darkness. Then the searchlight shifted, and she was gone. The storm passed by noon the next day, leaving behind a coastline transformed by its fury. Trees lay uprooted across Route 1, power lines dangled like broken spiderwebs. But the Morrison Lighthouse still stood battered, dark, but standing the way it had stood through every storm for 150 years. I spent the first 3 days in Maine Medical Center in Portland, recovering from hypothermia, bruised ribs, and what the doctors called extreme stress reaction. Emma stayed by my bed the entire time, sleeping in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, refusing to leave even when her supervisors called. "The case can wait," she told them. "My father can't." On the 4th day, the FBI came to take my statement. Special Agent Diana Reyes led the interview, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who reminded me of Ruth in the way she listened more than she spoke. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "thanks to your evidence, we've been able to expand this investigation far beyond what we initially anticipated." She laid photographs on my hospital bed. Chen Wei, silver-haired and distinguished in a tailored suit, being led from a luxury high-rise in Seattle in handcuffs. Dr. Victor Hale, his medical license displayed on the wall behind him, sitting in an interrogation room with his lawyer, Richard Crane, Melissa's uncle, and the family's legal architect, arrested at Portland International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Vancouver. Chen Wei's organization operated across 6 states, Agent Reyes explained. Washington, Oregon, California, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. We've identified 32 victims so far, elderly property owners who were systematically drugged, isolated, and manipulated into signing over their assets. 32. I thought about all those other families, all those other sons and daughters who never got the call I got from Emma. How many died? Agent Reyes hesitated. 7. Confirmed. We're investigating 4 more cases that were previously ruled natural causes or accidents. 11 people. 11 lives cut short, so Chen Wei could launder money through coastal real estate. The total assets stolen exceed $47 million, she continued. Your property alone was valued at $4.2 million, but it was also strategically important. Chen Wei had already secured agreements with overseas investors to develop a luxury resort on your land. The deal was worth $8 million, with most of that money coming from accounts we believe are connected to organized crime in Shanghai. I looked at the photograph of Chen Wei. He looked like someone's grandfather. Kind eyes, gentle smile, the same mask Melissa had worn. "What about Melissa?" I asked. Agent Reyes exchanged a glance with Emma. "She's cooperating, fully. Her testimony has been instrumental in building the case against her father. She's provided documents, account numbers, recordings, everything we needed to connect Chen Wei to the entire operation. She said she wanted to stop. After she found out about Ruth, we believe that's true. Our psychological evaluation suggests she was raised in an environment of extreme control. Chen Wei used his children as tools from a young age. Her brother David, Sophie's father, cut ties with the family years ago. Melissa wasn't given that choice. I thought about the woman who had fed me pills, who had smiled while slowly poisoning me, who had discussed my potential death like a scheduling conflict. I wanted to hate her. Part of me did hate her, but another part remembered the crack in her voice when she said Sophie's name, the tears on her face in the lantern room, the way she dropped the syringe without being forced. What will happen to her? That depends on the prosecutors. Given her cooperation, she'll likely receive a reduced sentence, but she'll still serve time. What she did to you, what she did to all the victims, that doesn't disappear because she had a difficult childhood. Emma squeezed my hand. Dad, you don't have to worry about any of them anymore. They're going away for a long time. Agent Reyes gathered her photographs. Mr. Morrison, I've been doing this job for 18 years. I've seen a lot of victims. Most of them never get justice. Most of them never even know what happened to them until it's too late. She paused at the door. What you did, fighting back, gathering evidence, surviving until help arrived, you saved yourself. But you also saved everyone who would have come after you. Chen Wei's operation is finished. Because of you. After she left, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. 40 years of pulling people from the ocean. Hundreds of rescues. I'd always thought that chapter of my life was over, that I was just an old man waiting to die in a lighthouse that had become more museum than home. But maybe the most important rescue of my life wasn't the 347 names in my journal. Maybe it was my own. The federal courthouse in Portland rose like a granite temple against the February sky, cold, imposing, and utterly indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded within its walls. I'd been inside courtrooms before, mostly as a witness in maritime accident cases, but I'd never sat in the front row of a gallery, watching my own son stand trial for trying to kill me. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence, objections, and legal maneuvering that turned the worst months of my life into exhibits and transcripts. 3 weeks of seeing Jack in an orange jumpsuit, his shoulder still bandaged from Emma's bullet, refusing to meet my eyes. The prosecution called 47 witnesses. Victims from Washington and Oregon described the same pattern I'd experienced: the friendly caretaker, the mysterious supplements, the gradual fog that descended over their minds. Doctors explained the effects of the drug cocktail Melissa had administered. Financial experts traced the money through shell companies and offshore accounts. FBI agents presented the surveillance footage, the recorded conversations, the paper trail that connected Chen Wei's empire to organized crime syndicates in 3 countries. And then they called me. I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, victims' families, curiosity seekers who wanted to see the old lighthouse keeper who had brought down a criminal empire. But I only saw one face: Jack. He was watching me now. Finally. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not remorseful, just empty. Like the son I'd raised had vacated his body, leaving behind a stranger in familiar skin. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Patricia Hartwell, guided me through my testimony with surgical precision. I described the pills, the isolation, the forged documents, the conversation I'd overheard about increasing my dosage until I stopped being a problem. I described the night of the storm, the confrontation in the lantern room, Jack's hands around my throat, the wrench raised to crush my skull. "Mr. Morrison," Hartwell said, "in the recording played for this court, your son Jack Morrison states, and I quote, 'Then we inherit everything anyway.' Problem solved. In your understanding, what did the defendant mean by problem solved?" I looked at Jack. He looked away. He meant that if I died from the increased medication, they wouldn't need to have me committed. They would inherit the lighthouse directly. My death would solve their problem. And when Miss Chen asked what would happen if you didn't survive the increased dosage, what was the defendant's response? He said, "Problem solved." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I saw one of the jurors, a woman about Emma's age, press her hand to her mouth. The defense attorney tried his best during cross-examination. He painted Jack as a desperate man, manipulated by sophisticated criminals, a son who loved his father, but made terrible choices under financial pressure. He pointed out that Jack had never actually struck me, that the wrench never made contact, that Emma's gunshot had prevented any real harm. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "isn't it possible that your son was simply trying to scare you, that he never actually intended to kill you?" I thought about the question for a long moment. "I spent 40 years rescuing people from the ocean," I finally said. "I've seen men drown. I've seen men fight for their lives. I've seen the look in someone's eyes when they've decided to let the water take them." I paused, meeting Jack's gaze across the courtroom. I saw that look in my son's eyes when he raised that wrench. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to end me. The defense had no further questions. Chen Wei's trial was held separately in Seattle, but we watched the verdict on the news, guilty on all counts, including 7 charges of second-degree murder for the victims who had died in his facilities. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He was 63 years old. He would die in prison. Dr. Victor Hale pleaded guilty to fraud, elder abuse, and practicing medicine under false pretenses. 18 years. Richard Crane, the family lawyer who had structured the shell companies, received 12 years for money laundering and conspiracy. And then came the day I'd been dreading. Jack Morrison, my firstborn son. The boy who had taken his first steps in the Lighthouse kitchen, who had learned to sail in the harbor below, who had carried Ruth's casket beside me 3 years ago, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of elder abuse, guilty of wire fraud, guilty of attempted theft by deception. The judge, a stern man named Harrison, who had presided over the entire trial with barely concealed disgust, looked at Jack for a long moment before delivering the sentence. Jack Morrison, you betrayed the most sacred trust that exists between human beings, the trust between parent and child. You conspired to drug, deceive, and ultimately kill your own father for financial gain. The court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison. 22 years. Jack would be 64 when he got out, older than I was when this nightmare began. He didn't look at me as the guards led him away. Spring came late to Rockport that year, as if even the seasons needed time to recover from what had happened. The ice finally retreated from the harbor in mid-April, and the lobster boats returned to their moorings like old friends coming home. The power lines had been repaired, the fallen trees cleared, and Route 1 was open again. Life, as it always does, moved forward. But I wasn't ready to move forward. Not yet. Not until I'd finished what I started. The idea had come to me during those long nights in the hospital, when sleep wouldn't come and the weight of everything pressed down like the ocean itself. Ruth had saved Sophie Chen on the East Cliff. Ruth had died there. And now, because of that sacrifice, I had survived to bring down the people who wanted to steal our legacy. The lighthouse needed to mean something more than real estate values and development permits. It needed to mean something that would last. I called Emma first, then Sam O'Brien, then Margaret Chen, no relation to the other Chens, just a good woman who had lived next door for 30 years and made the best clam chowder in Maine. I called Father Patrick from St. Peter's and Dr. Sarah Webb from the Historical Society, and the families of the 32 victims who had been identified in Chen Wei's scheme. By the time the snow melted, we had a plan. The dedication ceremony took place on May 15th, Ruth's birthday. 300 people gathered on the grounds of the Morrison Lighthouse that afternoon. Victims and their families had traveled from as far as Seattle and San Francisco. Local fishermen stood shoulder to shoulder with FBI agents. The governor sent a representative. The Coast Guard sent an honor guard. But the most important guests were the smallest. Sophie Chen, now 10 years old, stood at the front of the crowd holding her father David's hand. She had her grandmother's eyes, Chen Wei's eyes, but there was nothing of his cruelty in her face. Just a child who had lost her mother, been saved by a stranger, and grown up not knowing the terrible web that connected her family to mine. David Chen had reached out to me 2 months after the trial. He'd seen my testimony on the news and recognized Ruth's name. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with guilt that wasn't his to carry before finally calling. "I'm sorry," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what my family did to yours." "You didn't do anything," I'd told him. "You walked away from your father years ago. That took courage, not enough courage. I should have known. I should have stopped him. You couldn't have known. And your daughter Ruth would have been glad to know Sophie grew up safe. That's what mattered to her. That's always what mattered." Now Sophie stood before the crowd, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself from the cliffs where Ruth had saved her life. The bronze plaque had been mounted on a granite boulder at the base of the lighthouse, facing the sea. I'd written the words myself, revised them 100 times, and finally settled on something simple: the Ruth Morrison Memorial Lighthouse, in memory of Ruth Ellen Morrison, 1958 to 2022, who gave her life to save a child, and whose light continues to guide us home. Broken things can be beautiful again. Below the dedication, a smaller inscription read, "This lighthouse is hereby designated a permanent maritime heritage site, protected in perpetuity for the people of Maine and all who seek safe harbor." The legal work had taken months. Emma had helped me navigate the paperwork, the trust documents, the conservation easements that would ensure no developer could ever touch this land. The Morrison Lighthouse would never be sold, never be demolished, never be turned into a resort for money launderers. It would remain what it had always been, a light in the darkness. Father Patrick said a few words. The Coast Guard commander spoke about Ruth's legacy and the lives saved by the Morrison family over 4 generations. The governor's representative presented a proclamation declaring May 15th Ruth Morrison Day in the state of Maine. Then it was my turn. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the crowd, and for a moment couldn't speak. Emma was there, tears streaming down her face. Sam stood beside her, his weathered hand on her shoulder. And everywhere I looked, I saw people Ruth had touched: neighbors, friends, strangers whose lives had intersected with ours in ways large and small. Ruth used to say that lighthouses don't save ships, I finally said. They just show the way. The ships have to save themselves. I paused, steadying my voice. She showed me the way for 43 years. And even after she was gone, she kept showing me, kept reminding me that there was something worth fighting for. I looked at Sophie Chen, who was watching me with those dark, serious eyes. Thank you for being worth fighting for, I said to her. Thank you for giving Ruth's sacrifice meaning. Sophie stepped forward and placed her wildflowers at the base of the plaque. Then she did something no one expected. She hugged me, her small arms wrapping around my waist, her face pressed against my chest. Thank you for not giving up, she whispered. Above us, the lighthouse beacon began its evening rotation, sweeping its light across the darkening sea. Ruth's light, still burning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, almost exactly 1 year after the night of the storm. I recognized Jack's handwriting immediately, the same cramped, slanted script he'd had since 3rd grade, when his teacher Mrs. Patterson had despaired of ever teaching him proper penmanship. The envelope was plain white, stamped with the return address of the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. I held it for a long time without opening it. Emma had called that morning, as she did every Sunday and Wednesday now. She'd moved back to Maine after the trial, transferred to the state police, and bought a small cottage 3 miles from the lighthouse, close enough to check on me, far enough to have her own life. You don't have to read it, she'd said, when I told her about the letter. You don't owe him anything, Dad. I know. He tried to kill you. He conspired with criminals. He was willing to let you die so he could sell a piece of property. I know, Emma. A pause. But you're going to read it anyway. He's still my son. She didn't argue. She understood, even if she couldn't forgive. I opened the letter that evening, sitting in Ruth's chair by the window, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the October darkness. Dear Dad, I've written this letter 14 times. Each time, I tear it up because nothing I say sounds right. Nothing I say can undo what I did. But my counselor says I need to try. So here I am, trying. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to read this. If I were you, I would have burned it the moment I saw the return address. Maybe you did. Maybe I'm writing to no one. But if you're still reading, I need you to know something. I'm sorry. Not because I got caught. Not because I'm sitting in a cell that's 8 feet by 10 feet, counting the 7,847 days until I'm eligible for parole. I'm sorry because I became someone I never thought I could be. I'm sorry because when I look in the mirror now, I don't recognize the man staring back. You asked me once, when I was 12, what I wanted to be when I grew up. Somewhere along the way, I lost that. The gambling started in college, small bets, March Madness pools, nothing serious. But it grew. It always grows. By the time I realized I had a problem, I was in too deep to climb out. And when Chen Wei's people approached me with a solution, I convinced myself I had no choice. That's the lie addicts tell themselves. There's always a choice. I just kept making the wrong ones. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm not asking you to visit or to write back, or to ever think about me again. I know I don't deserve any of that. I know I don't deserve a father who spent his whole life saving strangers while his own son was plotting against him. But I need you to know that I remember who you are. I remember the man who taught me to sail, who showed me how to read the weather and the clouds, who sat with me all night when I had nightmares about Mom being swept away by a wave. I remember the man who never raised his voice, who never raised his hand, who showed me what real strength looked like. I forgot all of that when I let greed and desperation take over. But I remember now. Every day in here. I remember. Mom would be ashamed of me. I know that. Sometimes I dream about her, and she's standing on the east cliff in her blue cardigan, just looking at me. Not angry, not disappointed, just sad. That's worse than anything else, knowing how sad she would be. I'm getting help in here. Addiction counseling, therapy, whatever they offer. Not because it will get me out sooner, nothing will change my sentence, but because I don't want to be this person anymore. I want to find my way back to the kid who wanted to be like his dad. I don't know if I'll ever make it, but I'm going to try. If you can find it in your heart to write back someday, even just a few words, it would mean everything to me. But if you can't, I understand. Some things can't be fixed. Some broken things stay broken. I love you, Dad. I know I have no right to say that after everything I did, but it's true. It was always true, even when I was too lost to show it. Your son, Jack. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of Ruth's writing desk, next to her reading glasses and the anniversary card I'd never gotten to give her. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its endless rotation. 43 years of marriage. 2 children. One who became a hero. One who became a cautionary tale. Ruth used to say that broken things could be beautiful again, but she also knew that some breaks were too deep, some damage too complete. I didn't know yet which kind this was. I pulled out a sheet of paper and picked up my pen. Dear Jack, I wrote those 2 words. Then I sat there for an hour, watching the light sweep across the sea, trying to figure out what came next. I finished the letter to Jack 3 weeks later. It wasn't long, just a single page, written and rewritten until the words finally felt right. I didn't promise forgiveness. I couldn't. But I told him I was glad he was getting help. I told him I remembered the boy he used to be. And I told him that if he ever found his way back to that boy. I mailed it on a Thursday morning, watching the envelope disappear into the blue mailbox outside the Rockport post office. Then I drove back to the lighthouse, made myself a cup of Ruth's favorite Earl Grey tea, and sat in her chair, watching the sea. A year and a half had passed since the night of the storm. The nightmare was over. The criminals were in prison. The lighthouse was protected. My daughter lived 3 miles away and called twice a week. Sam O'Brien still brought Margaret's clam chowder every Tuesday. I should have been at peace, but the lighthouse felt different now. The halls where Ruth and I had raised our children. The kitchen, where we'd shared 40 years of morning coffee. The bedroom where she'd taken her last breath before the cancer won. Every room held memories that pressed against my chest like stones. I wasn't running from those memories. I was drowning in them. Emma noticed first. She always did. Dad, she said one Sunday afternoon, finding me standing at the base of the east cliff where Ruth had fallen. When's the last time you left this property for something other than groceries? I had to think about it. The memorial ceremony. May. That was 8 months ago. I have everything I need here. She took my arm and turned me to face her. At 39, she looked more like Ruth every day, the same determined eyes, the same stubborn set of her jaw when she knew she was right. You saved 347 people in your career, she said. You survived being poisoned by your own son. You helped bring down a criminal empire, and now you're going to spend the rest of your life as a ghost, haunting your own lighthouse? I'm not haunting anything. I'm just here. That's the problem, Dad. You're just here. You're not living. You're waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. Maybe for Mom to walk through the door. Maybe for Jack to come home. maybe for permission to move on. I pulled away from her, angry in a way I couldn't explain. Your mother is dead. Your brother is in prison. What exactly am I supposed to move on to? Emma didn't flinch. That's what I'm asking you to figure out. She left me there on the cliff, the wind cutting through my jacket, Ruth's ghost nowhere to be seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the lighthouse the way I had 1,000 times before, checking the beacon, testing the generator, running my hands along the walls my great-great-grandfather had built. But for the first time, the familiar routine felt like a cage instead of a comfort. I climbed to the lantern room and stood where Jack had tried to kill me. The Fresnel lens rotated slowly, its beam sweeping out across the dark Atlantic. Somewhere out there, ships were finding their way home because of this light. Strangers I would never meet were safe because 4 generations of Morrisons had kept this beacon burning. But what about me? Who was keeping my light burning? I thought about Ruth, standing on this same spot during storms, watching for my boat. She'd never been afraid, not because she was naive, but because she trusted that I would always find my way back to her. You can't find your way back if you never leave, she used to say. I heard her voice so clearly. I turned around, expecting to see her standing there in her blue cardigan. But the lantern room was empty. Just me, and the light, and the endless sea. The next morning, I called Emma. I've been thinking about what you said, and I don't know how to move on. I don't know how to leave this place. Everything I've ever been is here. Ruth, the lighthouse, the memories. If I leave, I'm afraid I'll lose all of it. Dad. Her voice was gentle. You can't lose Mom. She's not in the lighthouse. She's in you. She's in me. She's in me. She's in me. She's in me. She's in the way you make tea, and the way you watch the weather, and the way you still set 2 places at the table even though you live alone. I felt tears on my cheeks, the first I'd cried since the trial. You don't have to leave forever, Emma continued. Just live the life you two planned before she got sick. Ruth and I had dreamed of traveling after I retired. Italy, Greece, the coast of Ireland. We'd collected brochures and made lists and promised each other that someday, when the lighthouse had a new keeper, we would finally see the world beyond Rockport Harbor. Then the cancer came, and someday became never. I don't know how to do this without her, I said. None of us do, Dad. But she'd want you to try. You know she would. I looked out the window at the lighthouse, its white tower gleaming in the morning sun. Okay, I said finally. Okay, I'll try. The first trip was the hardest. I stood in the Portland International Jetport with a single suitcase, the same one Ruth and I had bought together 30 years ago for a trip to visit her sister in California. The leather was cracked now, the wheels squeaky, but I couldn't bring myself to replace it. It still smelled faintly of her perfume. Emma had driven me to the airport, insisted on walking me to security, and hugged me longer than she had since she was a child. Call me when you land, she said. It's a 6-hour flight. I'll be fine. Call me anyway. I looked back 3 times before I reached the security line. She was still standing there, watching, making sure I didn't turn around and run back to the lighthouse. Ireland. That's where I went first. Ruth's grandmother had emigrated from County Clare in 1920, and Ruth had always wanted to trace her family's roots. We'd planned to do it for our 40th anniversary, but then the doctors found the tumor, and anniversary plans became hospital schedules, and Ireland became another someday that never arrived. I landed in Shannon Airport on a gray March morning, rented a car I barely knew how to drive, and promptly got lost on roads so narrow they made Maine's back lanes look like highways. But somehow, after 3 wrong turns and 1 near collision with a sheep, the wind hit me like an old friend, the same salt-tinged, bone-deep cold I knew from Rockport, but wilder somehow, ancient in a way the American coast couldn't match. Below me, the Atlantic crashed against rocks that had stood for millions of years, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out on their edges. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the East Cliff, where she'd fallen, I thought about how the ocean had taken her from me, and how standing here, surrounded by that same ocean, I felt closer to her than I had in months. You would have loved this, I said out loud. The wind took my words and scattered them across the water. I spent 3 weeks in Ireland. I found the village where Ruth's grandmother had been born, a cluster of stone cottages and green fields that looked exactly like the photographs in Ruth's family album. The local pub owner, a man named Seamus, who had to be at least 80, remembered stories his own grandmother had told about the O'Briens who left for America. They said Mary O'Brien had the site, he told me over a pint of Guinness. I thought about Ruth's ghost pointing toward Melissa's cottage. I thought about the warnings I'd almost ignored. Maybe it runs in the family, I said. From Ireland, I went to Italy. Ruth and I had dreamed of renting a villa in Tuscany, spending lazy afternoons drinking wine and watching the sun set over olive groves. I couldn't afford a villa, but I found a small pensione in a hill town called Montepulciano, run by a widow named Lucia, who reminded me so much of Ruth that it hurt to look at her. Lucia didn't speak much English, and my Italian was limited to phrases from a guidebook. But somehow, we understood each other. She lost her husband to the sea too, a fishing accident off the coast of Sicily, 40 years ago. She showed me his photograph, and I showed her Ruth's, and we sat in her garden drinking wine as the sun went down. La vita continua, she said, raising her glass. La vita continua, I repeated. Greece came next, then Portugal, then the southern coast of Spain, where I watched flamenco dancers in Seville and thought about how Ruth would have tried to learn the steps, laughing at herself when she stumbled. 6 months. I traveled for 6 months, sending Emma postcards from every stop, calling her twice a week to assure her I hadn't fallen off a cliff or gotten swindled by pickpockets. I ate foods Ruth would have loved. I saw sunsets she would have photographed. I met people she would have befriended within minutes. And slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice it happening. The weight began to lift. I wasn't forgetting Ruth. I could never forget Ruth, but I was learning to carry her differently, not as a stone in my chest, but as a light in my pocket, something I could take out and look at when I needed her, then tuck away and keep walking. On my last night in Barcelona, I sat on the beach watching the Mediterranean waves roll in. They were gentler than the Atlantic, warmer, softer, less demanding, but they were still the ocean, still connected to the waters off Rockport, to the lighthouse, to everything I'd left behind. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Emma, coming home next week, ready to figure out what's next. Her reply came immediately. Can't wait. The lighthouse misses you. I miss you. I smiled at the screen. The first real smile in longer than I could remember. Ruth was right. You can't find your way back if you never leave, but you can always find your way home. The lighthouse looked smaller than I remembered. Emma picked me up at Portland International on a crisp September afternoon. The leaves just beginning to turn gold along the highway. I'd been gone 6 months, traveled through 7 countries, and somewhere over the Atlantic on the flight home, I'd realized something that should have been obvious all along. The lighthouse wasn't my prison. It never had been. I'd been my own jailer. We drove in comfortable silence through towns I'd known my entire life. Brunswick, Bath, Wiscasset, the familiar names like beads on a rosary. Emma looked different somehow, lighter. There was a peace in her face that hadn't been there when I left. You look good, I said. She glanced at me and smiled. So do you. You've got color in your cheeks, and you're not hunching anymore. Was I hunching? Like you were carrying the world on your shoulders. You're standing straighter now. When we turned onto the Peninsula Road and the lighthouse came into view, I felt something I hadn't expected. Joy. Not the heavy, grief-soaked attachment I'd felt before I left, but something cleaner, simpler. The lighthouse was beautiful white tower against blue sky, beacon gleaming in the afternoon sun, and I was glad to see it. But I was also glad I'd left. Sam O'Brien was waiting on the porch with Margaret's clam chowder. Some things never changed, and Father Patrick had stopped by with a bottle of Irish whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. The house was spotless, the garden tended, the generator serviced. Emma and Sam had taken care of everything while I was gone. "Welcome home, Harry," Sam said, gripping my hand with the strength of 50 years of friendship. "You look like a new man." "I feel like one." That evening, after the visitors left and Emma went home to her cottage, I walked the lighthouse grounds alone for the first time in 6 months. The memorial plaque for Ruth gleamed in the fading light. The east cliff where she'd fallen was covered in wildflowers. Someone had planted them while I was away. I climbed to the lantern room and watched the sunset paint the ocean in shades of orange and gold. The Fresnel lens began its nightly rotation, the beam sweeping out across the darkening water. For 150 years, this light had guided sailors home. For 40 of those years, I'd been part of that legacy. But legacy wasn't the same as identity. I thought about Seamus in Ireland, telling stories about ancestors I'd never met. I thought about Lucia in Italy, raising her glass to a life that continued despite loss. I thought about the flamenco dancers in Seville, the fishermen in Portugal, the strangers on trains and planes who'd shared their stories and listened to mine. The world was so much bigger than Rockport Harbor. Ruth had always known that. She'd dreamed of showing me. Now, I understood what she'd meant. The next morning, I made a phone call I'd been thinking about for 3 weeks. Maine Historical Society. "This is Dr. Sarah Webb." "Sarah, it's Harry Morrison. I have a proposition for you." 2 hours later, Sarah sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes wide as I explained my plan. "You want to donate the lighthouse?" she asked. "The whole property?" "Not donate. Transfer to a trust, the Ruth Morrison Memorial Trust. It would be managed by the Historical Society, maintained as a working lighthouse and maritime museum, open to the public, educational programs for schools, overnight stays for families who want to experience what lighthouse keeping was like. Harry, this property is worth millions. I know what it's worth. I also know what it cost. I looked out the window at the tower that had defined my family for 4 generations. I spent 40 years thinking this lighthouse was my purpose. Then I spent 2 years thinking it was my prison. Now I understand what it really is. What's that? A gift. One that was never meant to be hoarded by one family. Ruth knew that. That's why she wanted the memorial here, not because she was attached to the property, but because she believed lighthouses belonged to everyone. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Where will you go?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since Barcelona. The answer had come to me somewhere over the Atlantic, watching the sun rise through an airplane window. Emma found a cottage in town. Small place, walking distance to the harbor. I can still see the lighthouse from the bedroom window. I smiled, and I'm thinking about teaching. The Coast Guard has a training program for young rescue swimmers. They've asked me to consult. Harry Morrison, rescue instructor. Sarah shook her head in amazement. Ruth would be proud. Savin, times 7. 17M. Ruth would be proud. I hope so. We spent the rest of the morning working out details. Lawyers would need to be involved, paperwork filed, transitions planned. But by noon, the framework was in place. The Morrison Lighthouse would live on. Just not as the Morrison family's private burden. That evening, I stood on the Widow's Walk one last time as the lighthouse keeper. The beacon swept its beam across the water, the same way it had for 150 years. Ships would still find their way home. Strangers would still be saved by this light. But tomorrow, I would begin a different kind of keeping. The keeping of myself. The letters started arriving 2 weeks after the trial ended. At first, there were just a few handwritten notes from families in Oregon and Washington who had seen my testimony on the news. They thanked me for speaking out. They told me about their own parents and grandparents who had been victimized by Chen Wei's network. They said my story had given them hope. Then the trickle became a flood. By the time I returned from my travels, Emma had collected 3 boxes of correspondence. Letters from all 6 states where Chen Wei had operated. Letters from families who had lost everything. Letters from survivors who had been too afraid to speak until they saw an old lighthouse keeper stand up in a federal courtroom and tell the truth. I read every single one. Eleanor Hartley, 79, from Astoria, Oregon. Her daughter and son-in-law had convinced her she had Alzheimer's. They'd moved her into Coastal Haven, the same facility where Chen Wei had planned to send me, and drained her accounts of $340,000 before she died 6 months later. Her granddaughter wrote to tell me that because of my testimony, the FBI had reopened her grandmother's case as a potential homicide. Thomas and Maria Santos, 82 and 78, from Burlington, Vermont. A financial advisor connected to Chen Wei had convinced them to reverse mortgage their home of 50 years. When the scheme collapsed, they lost everything. They were living in their daughter's basement when Maria saw my story on television. She cried for 3 hours, her daughter wrote, because for the first time someone believed that what happened to them wasn't their fault. William Chen, no relation to the criminal family, 84. From Seattle. A retired professor who had been drugged with the same cocktail Melissa gave me. His wife noticed the symptoms, did her own research, and pulled him out before the worst could happen. They wrote to thank me together, their signatures shaky but determined. 15 victims confirmed by the FBI. But the letters told a different story. For every case that made it into the official count, there were 3 more that had slipped through the cracks, families too ashamed to report what happened. Victims who had died before anyone realized they'd been targeted. Cases dismissed by local police as family disputes or natural decline. The real number wasn't 15. It was closer to 50. Maybe more. I started making phone calls. The first was to Eleanor Hartley's granddaughter, a woman named Jessica who lived in Portland, Oregon, not Maine. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her grandmother's final months, isolated in a facility where no one believed her complaints, dismissed as confused whenever she tried to explain that her own daughter was stealing from her. The hardest part, Jessica said, is that everyone thought Grandma was crazy. Even me. At first, I believed my mother when she said Grandma was declining. I didn't visit. I didn't check. And by the time I realized something was wrong, it was too late. You couldn't have known, I told her. These people are professionals. They know exactly how to make victims look incompetent and families look caring. How do you live with it? The guilt? I thought about Jack. About all the signs I'd missed. About the son I'd raised who had become a stranger. You don't live with it, I said. You live through it. And you use what you learned to help others. That conversation planted a seed. Over the following months, I connected with victim advocacy groups across the country. I spoke at conferences about elder financial abuse. I testified before a congressional subcommittee examining gaps in federal protections for seniors. Emma helped me set up a foundation, the Ruth Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection, funded by the settlement money from Chen Wei's seized assets. The foundation's first project was a training program for local police departments, teaching officers to recognize the signs of elder exploitation. We developed materials, in partnership with the FBI, drawing on the patterns they'd identified in Chen Wei's operation, the isolation tactics, the medication manipulation, the forged documents, the sophisticated gaslighting that made victims doubt their own perceptions. By the end of the first year, we'd trained over 200 law enforcement officers in 12 states. 3 new cases of elder fraud had been identified and stopped because of what those officers learned. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what Chen Wei and his network had done. But it was something. On the anniversary of Ruth's death, I received a letter from Jessica Hartley. My grandmother used to say that lighthouses existed to warn ships away from danger, she wrote. I think that's what you're doing now, Mr. Morrison. You're a lighthouse for all of us, warning others about the rocks that almost destroyed our families. I read her words 3 times. Then I walked to Ruth's memorial plaque and read them aloud to her. I think I finally understand, I said to the granite stone. The lighthouse was never just about guiding people home. It was about keeping them safe along the way. The beacon swept its light across the water, the same way it had for 150 years, still keeping watch, still saving lives. 3 years after the storm, I drove to Danbury, Connecticut. The Federal Correctional Institution sat on a hill outside of town, its red brick buildings surrounded by razor wire and chain-link fences. It looked like a college campus designed by someone who hated hope, all the right architectural elements arranged in a way that crushed the spirit. I'd been corresponding with Jack for 18 months. After my first brief reply, the letters had continued, hesitant at first, then longer, more honest. He wrote about his therapy sessions, his addiction recovery meetings, his work in the prison library. He wrote about the books he was reading, the inmates he'd befriended, the small victories that marked his days. He never asked me to visit. But in his last letter, he'd mentioned that Emma had come to see him. "She didn't forgive me," he wrote. "I don't think she ever will. But she looked me in the eye and told me she hoped I'd find peace someday. That was more than I deserved. If Emma could do it, I could too." The visitation room was exactly what I expected. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, vending machines humming in the corner, families clustered at small tables, trying to have normal conversations. In the most abnormal setting imaginable, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in the same sickly pallor. Jack was already seated when the guard brought me in. He looked older. Of course he did. 3 years in prison will age anyone. But it was more than that. The desperate, hungry look that had frightened me in the lighthouse was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen in my son's eyes since he was a young man. Clarity. "Dad." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "You came." I sat down across from him. The table between us felt like an ocean. "I came." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. 3 years of letters had covered the practical matters, apologies offered and acknowledged, explanations given and received, the slow, painful work of understanding how we'd arrived at this place. But sitting face to face was different. Sitting face to face meant confronting the reality of what we'd lost. "I didn't think you would," Jack finally said. "After everything I did, I wouldn't have come if I were you." "I almost didn't." "What changed your mind?" I thought about the question, about the letters from victims, the foundation work, the training sessions where I taught police officers to recognize the signs of elder abuse, about Lucia in Italy, raising her glass to a life that continued, about Ruth, standing on the widow's walk, waiting for me to come home. "I spent 40 years pulling people out of the ocean," I said. "Some of them wanted to be saved. Some of them had given up. Some of them fought me the whole way, so convinced they were going to drown that they couldn't see the hand reaching out to help them." Jack's eyes filled with tears. "Which one was I? I don't know yet. That's why I'm here. To find out." We talked for 2 hours. Jack told me about the day he'd first placed a bet in college, a $50 wager on a basketball game that had seemed harmless at the time. He told me about the escalation, the lies, the desperate attempts to win back what he'd lost. He told me about the moment Chen Wei's people had approached him, offering a way out that had seemed too good to refuse. "They made it sound so simple," he said. "Just convince Dad to move to a facility. Just help with some paperwork. They said you'd be comfortable, well cared for. They said it was the kindest thing for everyone. And you believed them?" I wanted to believe them. "There's a difference." He met my eyes. I knew it was wrong. "Dad," from the very first meeting, I knew. But I was so deep in debt, so scared of what would happen if I didn't pay. I convinced myself I had no choice. I told myself you were getting confused anyway, that the facility would be good for you, that I was doing you a favor. You were going to let them kill me. The words hung in the air between us. Jack didn't flinch. "Yes," he said quietly. When Melissa talked about increasing the dosage, when she asked, "What would happen if you didn't survive?" I didn't stop her. I didn't say no. I told myself it would be quick, that you wouldn't suffer, that it was better than the alternative. His voice broke. I told myself a lot of things that let me sleep at night. None of them were true. I looked at my son, this stranger who had once been a boy I'd taught to sail, a teenager I'd helped with homework, a young man I'd walked down the aisle at his first wedding. The Jack I'd known had been ambitious, sometimes selfish, but never cruel. The Jack who had conspired with criminals to steal my life savings and end my life was someone I'd never imagined could exist. But they were the same person. That was the hardest truth of all. I can't forgive you, I said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jack nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know, but I can try to understand. I can try to see you as a person who made terrible choices, not just a monster who did terrible things. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You're still my son. Nothing changes that. Not even this. His hand trembled under mine. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that, he whispered. Good. I squeezed his hand once, then let go. That's all any of us can do. The guard called time. Jack stood, his prison uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. The first green shoot after a long winter. Will you come back? He asked. I thought about Ruth. About lighthouses. About the people we save and the people we lose and the ones who fall somewhere in between. Yes, I said. I'll come back. 5 years after the storm, I stood on the Widow's Walk of the Morrison Lighthouse for the dedication of the new Maritime Rescue Training Center. The building rose from the eastern edge of the property, a modern structure of glass and steel that somehow managed to complement the 150-year-old tower beside it. The Ruth Morrison Center for Maritime Safety. The plaque read, Training the next generation of rescue swimmers. 300 people had gathered for the ceremony. Coast Guard officers in dress whites, politicians seeking photo opportunities, journalists documenting the occasion. But the guests who mattered most stood in the front row. 17 young men and women in training uniforms, the first graduating class of the center's rescue swimmer program. I'd helped design the curriculum myself. 40 years of pulling bodies from the Atlantic, distilled into 6 months of intensive training. The physical conditioning, the survival techniques, the split-second decision-making that meant the difference between a successful rescue and a tragedy. But also the parts they didn't teach in the official manuals, how to read the fear in a drowning person's eyes, how to stay calm when the ocean was trying to kill you, how to carry the weight of the ones you couldn't save. Emma stood beside me as the Coast Guard commander handed out certificates. She'd been promoted to captain of the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit, the year before the youngest woman ever to hold the position. Ruth would have been impossibly proud. You did this, Dad, she said quietly. All of this. We did this. All of us. And it was true. The center had been built with funds from the Ruth Morrison Foundation, supplemented by a federal grant that Emma had helped secure through her contacts in law enforcement. Sam O'Brien had organized the local fishermen to donate materials and labor. Dr. Sarah Webb had coordinated with the Historical Society to ensure the new building met preservation standards. Even David Chen, Sophie's father, had contributed, wanting to honor the woman who had saved his daughter's life. The Morrison Lighthouse had become something I never could have imagined when I was a young keeper, climbing these stairs every night to tend the beacon. It was no longer just a light in the darkness. It was a living memorial, a training ground, a symbol of everything Ruth had believed about the power of ordinary people to save each other. After the ceremony, when the crowds had dispersed and the caterers were packing up, I walked alone to Ruth's memorial plaque. The bronze had weathered beautifully over the years, developing a patina that made it look like it had always been there, a natural part of the landscape rather than an addition. I traced her name with my finger. Ruth Ellen Morrison, beloved wife, mother, keeper of the light. You should see it, Ruth, I said. The center, the graduates, the foundation. You should see what your sacrifice started. The wind carried my words out to sea, the same way it had carried countless prayers and confessions from this cliff over the past century and a half. I thought about legacy, about what we leave behind when we're gone. Chen Wei had tried to build a legacy too, an empire of stolen wealth and broken families. His name would be remembered, but only as a cautionary tale. His children were scattered, his organization dismantled, his fortune seized and redistributed to his victims. In the end, all his scheming had accomplished nothing but pain. Jack was building a different kind of legacy now. He'd started a support group in prison for inmates struggling with gambling addiction. He'd earned his GED, then started college courses through a correspondence program. In his last letter, he'd told me he was studying psychology, hoping to become a counselor when he got out. 19 more years, but he was using the time to become someone different. I visited him every 3 months now. The conversations were still difficult, still weighted with everything that had happened between us, but they were real, honest. Two broken people trying to find their way back to something that resembled a family. And Emma. My daughter had taken the worst experience of our lives and transformed it into a mission. The Ruth Morrison Foundation had expanded to include legal assistance for elder abuse victims, educational programs for seniors about financial exploitation, and a hotline that had helped identify over 200 potential fraud cases in its first 3 years of operation. She'd testified before Congress twice, helped draft legislation in 4 states, and been featured in a documentary about elder protection that had won an Emmy. Ruth's legacy lived on through all of us, through the rescue swimmers who would save lives in her name, through the victims who found justice because of her foundation, through a family that had been shattered and was slowly, painfully learning to heal. I looked up at the lighthouse beacon, beginning its evening rotation as the sun sank toward the horizon, the same light that had guided my great-great-grandfather's ships, the same light that had watched over my marriage, my children, my career, the same light that had burned through the worst night of my life and was still burning now. Some things endure. Some lights never go out. Thank you, Ruth, I whispered, for everything. And somewhere in the wind, I could have sworn I heard her answer. I am 73 years old, and I have learned that life rarely ends the way we expect. It's a December morning, 6 years after the storm that nearly killed me. I'm sitting on the porch of my cottage in Rockport, watching the winter sun rise over the harbor. The Morrison Lighthouse stands on the peninsula a mile away, its white tower catching the first light of day. Even from here, I can see the beacon completing its final rotation before dawn makes it unnecessary. My lighthouse. My family's lighthouse. Now everyone's lighthouse. The coffee in my hands is warm, the way Ruth always made it strong, with just a splash of cream. I've gotten better at making it myself over the years. Not as good as hers, but close enough. Emma called last night to tell me she's pregnant. Her first child, my first grandchild. She and her husband, Michael, a Coast Guard lieutenant she met at the training center 2 years ago, are due in June. She wants to name the baby Ruth if it's a girl. And if it's a boy? I asked. She paused. We were thinking Harold. After you. I cried for 10 minutes after we hung up. Good tears. The kind that wash away old pain and make room for new joy. Jack will be eligible for parole in 13 years. He's 47 now, leading the addiction recovery program he started, finishing his psychology degree through correspondence. His letters have changed over the years, less apologetic, more thoughtful. He stopped asking for forgiveness and started focusing on becoming someone worthy of it. Maybe he'll get there. Maybe he won't. But he's trying, and that's more than I ever expected. I still don't know if I've forgiven him. The word feels too simple for something so complicated. What I know is that I've stopped carrying the weight of his betrayal like a stone in my chest. I've learned to set it down, to walk away from it, to come back to it only when I choose. That might not be forgiveness, but it's something close, something that lets me breathe. The foundation has grown beyond anything Ruth or I could have imagined. 23 states now have elder protection training programs based on our curriculum. The hotline has helped identify over 500 potential fraud cases. Last month, we received a letter from a woman in California whose mother was saved because a bank teller recognized the warning signs from one of our training videos. One life saved. That's all it takes to make everything worthwhile. I think about the 347 names in my rescue journal, the people I pulled from the ocean over 40 years. I think about the lives saved by the training center graduates, the fraud cases stopped by the foundation, the families protected because someone recognized the signs of exploitation. The numbers have grown too large to count. Ruth used to say that lighthouses don't save ships, they just show the way. But I've learned something else in these past 6 years. Sometimes showing the way is the most important kind of saving. Sometimes the light that guides someone home is worth more than the hands that pull them from the water. I finish my coffee and walk to the edge of my property, where a small path leads down to the harbor. The fishing boats are heading out for the day, their engines humming in the cold air. Sam O'Brien's grandson captains one of them. Now Sam passed away last spring, peacefully in his sleep, the way he always said he wanted to go. I miss him every day. But the boats keep going out. The lighthouse keeps shining. The world keeps turning, indifferent to our small human dramas. And somehow, that's comforting rather than sad. I'm 73 years old. I've lost my wife, nearly lost my life, and watched my son become a stranger, and then slowly, painfully, begin to find his way back. I've traveled the world and come home again. I've built something that will outlast me and learned to let go of things I thought I could never release. And I'm still here, still breathing, still watching the sunrise over the same ocean that has defined my entire existence. Ruth appears sometimes, in dreams that feel more like visits. She doesn't speak, she just smiles at me with those warm brown eyes and touches my face the way she used to when she wanted me to know everything was going to be all right. I wake from those dreams feeling peaceful, like I've been given permission to keep living. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I know how I want to spend it watching my grandchild grow, teaching young people to save lives, visiting my son and hoping he becomes the man he's trying to be, and sitting on this porch every morning, drinking coffee, watching the light. The lighthouse beam makes its final sweep of the morning and goes dark as the sun clears the horizon. Somewhere out there, ships are finding their way home. Somewhere out there, someone is being saved because a light showed them the way. That's enough. That's more than enough. I raise my coffee cup toward the lighthouse, toward Ruth, toward the legacy we built together, toward the life that continues despite everything that tried to end it. Thank you, I say to no one and everyone, for all of it. The sun rises higher, the day begins. And Harold Harry Morrison, lighthouse keeper, rescue swimmer, survivor, walks back inside to start living the rest of his story.